Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Konoha begs Naruto to return harem. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by CharitysSongbird and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1, Talking, Thinking Mental Conversation. Demon God are the like printed words. Jutsu, the tearful trail of the emperor. How long had it been going on now? An hour, two, maybe a day. I guess it doesn't matter, I can't believe it. After everything I'm still just a fox to them. My team Sasuke brought him back and now I'm here, thought the blonde boy as he looked down at his own mud-splattered feet, his orange pants already in ribbons from the fights only a day previously. He hadn't had a second set to change into at the hospital. Luckily he had another black shirt to cover up the scars now decorating his chest, but his orange pants were still a wreck. The fights. Oh right, the mission first, that big guy Choji sure showed him, and then that one girl and the bone guy. I guess Granny was able to help Lee after all, man, and it turns out Gaara showed up. I guess it's a good thing I brought Granny back, she's pretty cool when she's not drinking. These thoughts brought the faintest of smiles to his face, even as tears brimmed at the corner of his eyes, trailing down over the bandages upon his face, to drip silently down to the floor, even as the figures around him continued to debate. Their voices growing louder with each moment as the battle over him intensified. Everyone, we all made it back, and now this. I didn't even get to say goodbye. I don't want to leave them, everyone, I don't want to leave, shuddered the boy as these thoughts continued to swirl around in his mind, his face contorted into a look of pain, even as his body throbbed from the wounds that had only been patched hours before. As the boy's thoughts continued their assault above him upon a raised platform, a blonde-haired woman was slamming her fist once again into the stone structure, sending a web of cracks down it as she yelled again at the assembled group before her. I don't care if you think it's too dangerous, Konoha does not sell out one of our own. Roared Tsunade, her brown eyes flashing dangerously as she glared around at the council before her, each steadying themselves against the impressive waves of killing intent washing off of her. This is not a matter of selling anyone out, Tsunade, and you know it. Konoha has suffered too many losses after the invasion. Two of that group infiltrates us without effort and drove off our elite without even straining themselves. Called an elderly looking man, his spectacles face drawn into a hard look. Beside him sat his fellow, an elderly woman, her own brown worn with age, even as she steeled herself to speak, drawing the Hokage's eyes to her. Amura is correct, Hokage-sama. The matter is simple, the boy is a target, one for an enemy we cannot match. If we try, how many do you think will die for this boy? Asked the elderly woman as Tsunade's eyes narrowed upon her. And if you were the target, Kaharu? Fired back Tsunade as the elderly woman nodded, replying in a firm tone. Then I would leave, a shinobi's life is to protect the village, if my staying put my home and family in danger I would leave. I have taken missions that could have meant my death before, Hokage-sama, if it is for Konoha I have no fear of death. Replied the elder Kaharu as an angry growl drew a few eyes up to where a feral woman sat, her figures digging lightly into sleeves of her shirt as she fought to keep herself in check. Started Tsunade before the matriarch of the Inyazuka clan spoke, her tone harsh, as if trying to bit back her own words. Enough, Hokage-sama, this isn't easy for a lot of us, but it has to be done. Spoke Tsume as Tsunade's eyes narrowed upon the woman. So you'd sell him out to Akatsuki? Called Tsunade as Tsume jerked her eyes away from the woman, as well as the blonde boy standing just before her. If that's what has to be done to protect the village, yes. I won't lose my clan for that fox. Spoke Tsume, a mix of anger and self-loathing, dripping from every word she spoke as flashes of her injured son flashed past her eyes. At her words, Tsunade turned to the room, seeing that not one of the council stood with her, not one. The few like Tsume could not meet her eyes, while others showed open contempt for the boy down below, but all were united upon this decision. This is not the first time a shinobi has died or given their life for the village, Hokage-sama. My brother also gave his life for our safety. We ask no more of the boy than we would any other of our village. We are not killing the boy, he may survive, how is that any more a risk than any other mission? Spoke a stoic tone belonging to Hiashi Hyuga as he nodded towards where Naruto stood. You know damn well this isn't a mission. One genin against a gang of S-class criminals, and you want to pretend saying it's a mission makes it alright. Snarled Tsunade as another voice spoke. Hokage-sama, the council is in agreement, we can't order him as a shinobi, but we can remove him from the shinobi ranks. If we do this, he dies in disgrace, at least let his name be put upon the memorial stone for what he is sacrificing. Spoke Homura as he looked around the council, receiving a few nods, while others simply scoffed. Don't you dare try to act like you're doing this for him. Yelled Tsunade as above Tsume, a scarred man sighed, rubbing his head as he muttered to himself before speaking. No, Hokage-sama, we're doing this for the village, what we have to do to protect our home. Every shinobi must be ready to lay down their lives for their home and their comrades. The boy is a target, one we cannot protect, one that we cannot prepare, and one that could become a bigger threat to the village if he were to stay. Jinchuriki are dangerous enough just to have inside one's forces, and now he is a target on top of this. Hokage-sama the fox is not worth this. Finished Shikaku, as beside him Chimza Akimichi and Inoichi Yamanaka nodded in agreement with their longtime partner. His name is Naruto Uzumaki, you bastards, and I won't just sit by and let you throw him to the wolves. Yelled back Tsunade, pointing down to Naruto, with his one arm in a sling, his body still littered with medical wrappings, even as a bandaged man rose his action, drawing several eyes as spoke. Very well, Hokage-sama, the council has made its decision. Naruto Uzumaki, genin of Konoha, will be officially stripped of his rank after his chakra is sealed and banished for no less than 5 years, or until our forces have returned to their full strength for the greater safety of the village. Called Danzo as the council nodded, Tsunade starting to yell, but stopping as she saw the boy below her stiffen at the council's decision. Naruto, whispered Tsunade as the blonde looked up her, his blue eyes somehow dimmer as the trails from his tears drew small damp lines down his whiskered cheeks. The boy will report to the council tomorrow to have the sealing performed, failure to arrive will be. Started Danzo as another voice cut him off. Enough. I may not be able to stop you bastards from this, but I won't let you endanger him anymore. Called a white-haired man as he stepped forwards, glaring at Danzo, who gave the figure a steady look. As Jiraiya spoke, Naruto felt a small twinge in his stomach as what sounded like a whisper in his mind started to speak. However, before it could gain voice, Jiraiya had already moved forward, speaking as he did. Jiraiya-sensei. Whispered Naruto as the toad sage gave him a small smile, patting him on his head before looking back to Danzo, his eyes narrowed. A seal is too delicate to have a novice like you messing with it. Started the sage as Danzo nodded, turning fully to face the sage. Hi, and as Konoha's sealing expert I expect you to do the work yourself, Jiraiya. Now that you are here it can be done immediately. Spoke Danzo as Jiraiya bit back a curse, looking up to Tsunade, who now looked stricken. Bastards, you think I'll just nod and smile while you do this? Spat Jiraiya as he laid a hand gently upon Naruto's shoulder, pulling the boy closer to him. Above him the fight in Tsunade finally gave out as she slumped into her chair, gazing around at the council as Danzo continued to speak. No, Jiraiya, I expect you to honor your commitment to Konoha and this council. This is the will of Konoha and you will follow it through. Finished Danzo as Jiraiya glared before looking away as above him, Tsunade gave the room one final look before speaking, her voice breaking slightly as she struggled to keep from sobbing. Jiraiya, come to my office now. Naruto, you as well, this council is dismissed. Finished the blonde as the gathered shinobi and elders nodded, pushing themselves up and slowly filing out of the room, none looking down at the blonde boy who stood silently beside the two sages of Konoha. Those bastards. Roared Tsunade as she flung her desk into a wall, smashing the wooden frame more than a foot into the solid stone and causing an Anbu to try and dive out of their hiding spot, only to be caught by the Hokage's chair that impacted the masked figures with a loud crunch. As the Anbu flopped to the office floor unconscious, Naruto and Jiraiya moved a bit farther from the raging blonde, both fearful of getting caught up in her rage. Shizune. Called Tsunade as her assistant standing just a foot or so behind her scanned the room before nodding. That was the last one, Lady Tsunade. Spoke the black-haired woman as Tsunade smirked, looking around at the wreck of an office where the 5 hidden Anbu now lay unconscious, each accidentally hit by one of her projectiles in the course of her fit. Well, that was effective. Chuckled Jiraiya, moving over to prod one Anbu lightly with a foot before turning to see Shizune already dropping to kneel beside Naruto, pulling the boy into an embrace as Tsunade focused upon the sage. This is not a time for jokes, Jiraiya, we need to plan this out. That council isn't getting their way with this. What were you thinking? If you hadn't spoken up they wouldn't have been able to seal him. That was our last hope. Spat Tsunade as Jiraiya raised his hand defensively. Tsunade, we both know they would have tried anyway and Naruto would have been in even more trouble. I didn't have a choice. Called Jiraiya as he lowered his hands, turning to look down at Naruto, who blinked up at him. I'm sorry kid, it's all I could do. Spoke the sage as Naruto nodded slightly, looking around to Tsunade. It's okay sensei, you both did everything you could, but why are they doing this? Asked Naruto in a slightly odd tone as he looked up to Tsunade, who felt her own eyes brimming with tears as she moved over to the blonde teen. As she reached him she pulled him close into a hug, looking up to Jiraiya, her eyes burning with silent rage as she spoke. I don't know Naruto, I don't know, they've been planning this, I don't know how long, but they've been planning this, but we won't let them win, I promise you. We'll protect you Naruto, we'll train you, and we won't let the council stop us. Spoke Tsunade as Naruto looked at her, nodding. Really? Asked Naruto sadly, even as a small pang went up from his gut as Tsunade nodded, turning to Jiraiya before rising slowly, the light from the window catching the tears now dripping down her cheeks, allowing them to flash slightly in the dimness of the office. Jiraiya, I'm giving you a mission. You are to take Naruto outside the village, say it's for the sealing, I don't care, just get him out of here. Officially you'll be going on a mission to spy on the Akatsuki. Train him, keep my little brother safe. Spoke Tsunade firmly as Jiraiya nodded at her. Won't be easy, you know, keeping this quiet. He replied as Tsunade gave him a small grin. I trust you. she whispered before kneeling down to pull Naruto into another embrace, whispering apologies as Naruto returned the embrace, crying softly into her arms as he did. After a time the two finally broke apart, Naruto finding his emotions for some reason easy in check as he stood before her. "Don't worry, Tsunade," spoke Jiraiya, stepping forwards out of the light provided by the window to stand beside Naruto, his hand dropping down to ruffle the boy's blonde hair. "I'll make him ready to take your chair when he gets back," smiled Jiraiya as despite himself Naruto found himself smiling along with his sensei. "Hi, just you wait, I'll make them sorry for throwing me out," smiled Naruto as Tsunade gave a watery smile as the two disappeared in a flutter of leaves and wind, leaving Tsunade and Shizune in the destroyed remains of her office. "You'll be alright, Lady Tsunade," assured Shizune as Tsunade nodded, trying to keep from letting her sadness grip her again. Slowly she moved over to a cabinet that had survived her assault, pulling out a bottle as she did. "Lady Tsunade," started Shizune before the blonde woman cut her off with a look. "Don't try it, Shizune, I'm getting drunk and there's nothing you can do to stop me," spoke Tsunade as Shizune sighed, shaking her head slightly. "I wasn't going to, can I have some?" spoke Shizune sadly as her lady paused before pulling a pair of dishes out and tossing one to her apprentice. "Hi, I suppose so." After reporting to the council, Jiraiya and Naruto moved outside of the village, soon racing through a small clearing near the Valley of the End. As the two had made their way out, they passed the scarred landscape of each battlefield, dunes of sand, forests littered with weapons, while others were simply felled as if by some great scythe. Moving forwards helped somehow. The council meeting and ruling was still there, but somehow it didn't hang as heavily over him since Jiraiya had arrived. His sensei Jiraiya was right after all, it was just like a long training mission. That stupid council wouldn't get their way, and who cares about them anyway. Granny Tsunade would have the village back in shape in no time, and then he could come back. He still had those who cared about him, and he could count on them. As the pair of shinobi pushed on, Naruto's mind continued to shift, keeping from allowing the thoughts of his banishment to fall upon him. Instead, his mind showed him flashes of his arrival back in Konoha only a day ago. Kakashi had been there well briefly, he'd been so eager to get Sasuke and him to the hospital, he hadn't really been around to say much. Come to think of it, he didn't remember Kakashi staying with him at all, he'd just been interested in Sasuke. Same with Sakura, she'd barely stopped to greet him before rushing to check on her precious Sasuke. Come to think of it, who had visited me? There was Shikamaru. Lucky guy, only got a figure broken, and then who else? Shizune, Nichin, Granny Tsunade, oh, and Hinata and Shino. Huh, wonder why Hinata fainted like that. Huh, wait, where was Jiraiya sensei? Why didn't he visit me? Wondered Naruto as his blue eyes trailed up to his traveling companion, who was looking ahead, a focused look upon his brow. As he looked at the white-haired man, he felt a small pang in his gut, followed by a pulse in his temple, causing him to flinch slightly. Ow, what the? Wondered Naruto, blinking down at his stomach for a moment as he felt another pang and pulse, soon joined by a small itching sensation on top of his head. As he continued forwards into the woods, Naruto continued to get pang after pang, his head starting to throb, even as that itching intensified. Ah, what the hell is that? If this keeps up, I'll have to stop, but Jiraiya-sensei said we had to keep moving. Darn it, what is that? Wondered Naruto, reaching up with his unbandaged arm to scratch at that itchy spot. As his finger scraped across the spot, small flecks of ink began to dig under his nails. After a few scratches, it happened. Like a wave, the crushing reality of what had happened hit him again. The banishment, what it meant, what it was, how could he even think about being happy like before? What was wrong with him? Why was he just grinning like an idiot about this? Before these thoughts even had a moment to settle, the panging in his gut hit again, as the throbbing sensation in his head was suddenly replaced by something else. A voice. "You idiot, get out of there," roared a thunderous tone that caused Naruto to slip slightly as the massive wave of sadness and anger hit him full force, only drowned out by those words. "Kaiubi, what?" started Naruto before the fox roared out again, and Naruto felt that small twinges as the demonic chakra began to move through him. "Shut up and run, it's a trap, you fool. It's a trap, he's going to kill you," roared the fox, his words hitting Naruto just as hard as his own emotions. Swiveling his eyes around, he saw Jiraiya looking at him, giving a small smile as they continued forwards. "What, Iro-sensei wouldn't, you're lying," started Naruto, only to have Kaiubi cut him off again with another roar. "Idiot, he put a seal on you in that meeting to make you docile, he was lying the whole time. I can sense emotions he want against that bastard. At the council meeting he was with him. He stopped me then. He's going to kill you to get to me," yelled the fox again, as Naruto's eyes went slightly wide at the words, his mind flashing back to the pang he'd felt then just when Jiraiya had spoken. Before Naruto could begin to understand what was happening, Jiraiya suddenly came to stop as they reached the edge of the valley where Naruto had had his fight with Sasuke. Naruto was too late to stop himself as he landed beside Jiraiya, stiffening slightly as the older man turned to him with that same smile on his lips. "Well, Naruto? Ready to get that ceiling out of the way?" chuckled Jiraiya, stepping forwards on hand, reaching out towards the boy, only to have Naruto flinch back from him. It had been unintentional basic instinct, coupled with Kyuubi's words that had caused him to do it, and it was all that saved his life as he spied the seal upon Jiraiya's palm. No, no. Thought Naruto, his eyes bulging even as he saw the smile drop instantly from Jiraiya's face, and Kyuubi's roars began again. I'm not dying here, boy, run damn you. Take all of my chakra but run damn you. Roared Kyuubi as Naruto stumbled back, his body flooding with demonic chakra as he did. Without pausing, Jiraiya sprang forward, swiping his hand at the boy again, only to hit empty air as a cloak of chakra sprung up around Naruto, allowing him to fly backwards from the sage's grasp, even as 9 wavering tails of chakra exploded out of him, his eyes becoming slitted as his form took on a feral appearance. Kyuubi, I guess that seal wasn't enough. Spat Jiraiya as he readied himself, his words hitting Naruto like a physical blow. You're why? Called Naruto, his voice oddly feral as the Kyuubi continued to scream at him to run. But he had to know, why Jiraiya was doing this. So it's still you, Hagaki. Well, I wanted to do this clean, but looks like that fox doesn't want to go easily, just stand still, and I'll make it quick, okay? Spoke Jiraiya as Naruto looked horrified. But, started Naruto as Jiraiya gave an audible sigh. You're a danger to Konoha, Hagaki. I'm sorry, but we can't give the fox to Akatsuki, and we can't protect you from them, the only choice is this. Tsunade was too soft and we knew it, but banishment risks you coming back for revenge, and that can't be allowed either. For what it's worth, Gaki, I'm sorry, but we won't see Konoha burn just for you. Spoke Jiraiya. As his words filtered into Naruto's mind, something inside of him snapped, and with a roar of primal fury, Naruto shot forwards with blinding speed. Jiraiya only had a moment to blink before a searing pain opened up across his chest, and he found himself flying backwards into the tree line, his last glimpse of Naruto being a 9-tailed chakra shroud disappearing across the valley westward. Ah damn it. Managed Jiraiya, struggling to move, to rush after him even as his chest throbbed. The Kyuubi's chakra would have drawn the border patrol by now, damn it, the plan was to have it be Orochimaru who attacked and killed him. Now wait, that was it. Well kid, looks like you're a traitor now. Muttered Jiraiya as he groaned, holding one hand firmly to his chest, keeping the wound from opening further as he waited to be found. A day later, the story of how Orochimaru had arrived and offered Naruto the chance for revenge, and how the Jinchuriki had taken the offer, leaving Jiraiya barely alive in his wake, would be upon the lips of every soul of Konoha. On that day, the future life of Naruto Uzumaki was changed forever. It was a few weeks later that found Naruto stumbling through the deserts of Suna, with only his shattered thoughts and the fox for company. We're lost, you know. Spoke the fox lazily as Naruto gave an annoyed groan as he forced his chakra to remain even on his feet so he wouldn't sink into the sand. For the last time, no, we aren't. We're going to Suna, that's west and in the desert. This is exactly where we want to be. Shot back Naruto as the Kyuubi snorted. West and in the desert, oh well, that solves everything now, doesn't it? You've never been to Suna, you stupid meatbag. If it wasn't for my chakra keeping your body fed, you'd be dead by now. Spat the Kyuubi as Naruto sighed as he came to the top of a dune, only to see another on the horizon. For a moment Naruto just looked out across the dunes, his mind flashing over his life in one horrible river of pain. The orphanage, the glares and whispers, his teammates hate, the villages, Kakashi, Sasuke, Sakura, the council, Jiraiya, everyone. Slowly Naruto sank down onto the dune, his feet pushing into the warm sand as he allowed fresh tears to fall from his eyes. It was too much, just too much. What again? Honestly, when are you going to stop crying about this? Grumbled the fox as Naruto growled. Shut up. Muttered the teen as the fox gave a snort. What was that? I couldn't hear you over your blubbering meatbag. Snapped back the fox as Naruto glared down at his own stomach. Shut up, you stupid fox. Why, so you can go and feel sorry for yourself some more. You're wasting time and my chakra with your pity parties. Well, my life is ruined, I can't go home, my sensei betrayed me and I'm in the middle of the fucking desert, my life sucks. How like you even know the meaning of the word ruined? Try being used like a weapon for some red-eyed bastard twice, and then sealed with your body speared to a stone, and then ending up in a sewer for over 50 years. Then come crying to me. Spat the fox as Naruto stopped the fox's rant, catching him off guard. What? Never mind, meatbag, you're wasting my time. Snorted the fox as it tried to cut the connection, only to have Naruto's mind keep it open by force. Just tell me, you furball, or I'm not moving from this dune. Called Naruto as he folded his arms, plopping himself securely into the desert sand. For a few moments Kyuubi seemed willing to just let the boy sit there and sink into the sand. Ah fine, you idiot, but I'm not doing story time while you sit on your ass, get moving. Roared the fox as Naruto, despite himself, found a smile playing across his lips as he pushed himself up and started moving forwards. It was a wonder what winning an argument with a legendary chakra fox could do for one's mood. As Naruto set off down the newest dune and Kyuubi began his story back in Konoha, the days after Naruto's betrayal had been chaotic at best. The border patrol had found Jiraiya not long after Naruto's escape, the Kyuubi chakra having been like a beacon to draw them in. Fortunately or not, by the time they reached the man, he had already passed out from blood loss and was rushed back to Konoha for medical care. It had been a day before he had been conscious enough to spin his tale of how Orochimaru had set upon them and how he had offered Naruto the chance at getting revenge on the village. Tsunade's heart had seized when Jiraiya had told her of what had happened, how Naruto had turned on him using the Kyuubi's chakra to attack him before racing off with the snake. If Tsunade had not just spent the last half a day trying to save the sage's life from the demonic chakra of his wound, she wouldn't have thought it possible, but the wound left little doubt that Naruto had attacked Jiraiya. When the council had demanded answers, Jiraiya had again spun his tale, only the elders and Danzo knowing the truth of his mission. Before the day was out, Naruto had been placed as a missing nin in the files of Konoha, with an A-rank threat level. Despite the council's pleas, Tsunade refused to put a kill order out on the boy, yelling that if the council hadn't forced them to act, the boy would never have gone to Orochimaru, and that she wasn't going to kill the boy for their mistake. So against the council's wishes, Naruto was entered as a retrieval order only. What Tsunade had not expected, however, was for the council then to announce to the village at large of Naruto's betrayal and his status as the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. When Tsunade had demanded to know why she shouldn't have them killed for breaking the third's law, the response was simple. If he was now a danger to the village, their forces had to know what they could be running into. Looking out across the villages as the announcement had been made, Tsunade watched firsthand as those few who had supported Naruto had gone from shock to anger at the council's words, and seeing this, Tsunade's heart broke again as she turned to march back into her office, where she had been ever since. Inside the Hokage's office, Tsunade sat behind her desk, her head upon her folded arms as she shook with sobs, whispering apologies to the boy who had been like a brother to her. "I'm sorry, Naruto-kami, I'm sorry," whispered the blonde, reaching up to grab a bottle laying upon her desk and tearing off the top to get at the sake within. Beside the desk sat Shizune, much like her lady in a state of open depression, sipping at a bottle of her own, even as she tried and failed to find words to help with Tsunade's pain. If I'd fought harder, he cried Tsunade as Shizune moved over to hold her lady. "We will find him, Lady Tsunade, we'll find him," managed Shizune as Tsunade's brown eyes turned to her red from weeping. Slowly Tsunade nodded at the woman's words as she allowed herself to slip closer to the woman's embrace, knowing deep down that even if the boy were to return, that few would be there to welcome him. At the same time, across the village within a small training field, one of the few who would have welcomed Naruto back was even now watching as those who had been to boy's friends were discussing the blonde's recent departure, her wide pale eyes struggling to keep the moisture from escaping them. "I can't believe it, he was the fox all along," muttered a feral boy looking over to his stoic teammate, whose face was concealed by his oversized coat. "Kiba, he is a Jinchuriki, not the fox," replied the stoic figure as Kiba growled, looking away from his friend. "And that helps, he's a traitor now, he abandoned the village. What's it matter anymore?" muttered the teen as Shino let out a small sigh. "I suppose it doesn't anymore, though I wouldn't have thought it possible of him. Sasuke was shown to be influenced by the curse seal, but this is different," replied Shino as a sigh drew the pair's attention to another of the group who stood a few feet away. "You never know how someone will act when backed into a corner. The council was wrong, but it happened, and instead of trying to follow the Hokage's plan, he chose revenge. Now he's joined that traitor Orochimaru. Face it, he's not the guy we knew," muttered Shikamaru as beside him the Hivasa Choji nodded sadly. "Idiot, why? You all just risked your lives to bring Sasuke-kun back, and now this? I don't get it. I mean, the Hokage went out of her way to protect him, and he goes and turns traitor," shouted Ino as beside her Sakura nodded slowly. "It doesn't matter anymore, he's a traitor. He turned his back on everyone," whispered Sakura as she looked over to Ino, who nodded slightly. Beside the blonde, Shikamaru sighed, rubbing his forehead as he looked around at the members of the Rookie Nine gathered there. "So that's it then, we're in agreement?" asked Shikamaru looking around at the gathered genin, who nodded in agreement, all except Hinata, who continued to watch them deciding the fate of their blonde companion. "Alright, we'll handle this matter ourselves. Naruto Uzumaki is from our year, and we'll be the ones to bring him back to face his crimes or stop him if we need to," finished Shikamaru as the group nodded, each slipping of individually till only Hinata remained, finally allowing her tears to fall as she fell to her knees. "Naruto-kun, you wouldn't, I know you wouldn't, please come back," whimpered the Hyuga girl as she thought of the blonde knucklehead that she loved. Meanwhile, across the world in the land of wind, Naruto continued to trudge forwards through the desert, the sun having retreated for the day, leaving the moon to now hang over the vast sands, causing them to glow with an eerie white countenance. "So it was that Madara guy that did all this, that's crazy," muttered Naruto as the fox snorted. "No, that's the Uchiha, bunch of red-eyed bastards," grumbled the Kyuubi as Naruto nodded, continuing forwards. "And he's descended from your dad, wow, so you were a tree once?" asked Naruto as the fox snorted, letting out a deep chuckle. "I suppose you could say that, I was part of one anyway, all of my siblings were, it was only thanks to my father that we became something more," replied Kyuubi with what Naruto could almost call warmth to his tone. Sounds like an amazing guy. Replied Naruto as the Kyuubi chuffed. Of course he was, what would you expect from the father of the great Kyuubi? Called the fox as Naruto found himself smiling slightly as he looked on ahead. So your previous hosts were Uzumakis as well, that Mito and that Kushina lady? Asked Naruto, a small note of hope in his tone that did not go unnoticed to the fox. Hi, both of them, but unlike you their seals were more solid and painful. Can't say I ever spared more than a word with either, except for when that stupid Kushina would come to argue with me about something. Replied the fox as Naruto's heart sank slightly. He'd hoped that he would have learned a little more about the Uzumakis from the fox, but it seemed he was at a loss. For the fox, the previous seals had been true prisons, almost nothing got in or out, he only even knew who he had been sealed in due to those brief visits he had mentioned. Oh, I see. Still, at least you're willing to speak with me, I guess that's something better than the other Uzumakis. Muttered the fox as Naruto felt a small smile twitch at his lips. Thanks. Whispered Naruto as Kurama gave a small huff, ignoring the teen's comment as the pair continued forwards across the dunes. After a few days of travel, Naruto's body was finally reaching its limit. Thanks to Kyuubi's chakra he had been able to stave off exhaustion, burning it to keep his body going, but even this had its limits. Staggering forwards, Naruto found himself slipping down a sandy dune, his feet failing him as he slipped into a roll. As the teen's body banged down the embankment, he could vaguely hear Kyuubi's annoyed cries, but even that was somehow distant. Why my body so tired, just a little nap, you just a nap. Thought the boy as his body finally came to a halt, his eyes drifting shut, their last view being of some kind of green that he couldn't quite place, prompting one final thought before darkness claimed him. Well, what's a tree doing in the desert? As Naruto's consciousness faded, he could not know that at long last he had reached a land that none had traveled to since the days of the first Hokage. Lying against the border of the desert upon a small patch of grass that was the entrance into the land of the west, long since lost to the elemental nations. An unknown amount of time passed Naruto by as he lay unconscious. Vaguely he was aware his body was moving at times, but everything was a blur at best. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Naruto found himself coming into consciousness again, his eyes blinking the blurriness away as a soft light touched his eyes. Ugwa. Mumbled Naruto, noticing how dry his mouth had become as his eyes drifted around, taking in where he was lying. It was a small room, simple most would call it, but warm in its own way. A few small bits of furniture were scattered around, giving it a live feel to it. Pushing himself up slightly, Naruto found himself lying in a bed, the heavy quilts laying upon shifting as he sat up. Where? Muttered Naruto. Well, look who's back. Kyuubi. It looks like you passed out on the edge of the desert. I told you we weren't going the right way. Added the fox in an I told you so tone that caused Naruto to groan. You whatever. Muttered Naruto, pushing himself out of the bed, noticing as he did that he was dressed in only his boxers. As his feet touched the ground, a small noise drew his eyes around to the door, where a figure stood blinking at him, her hands held up to her mouth covering it as her yellow eyes met his. Naruto suddenly became very aware of his dress, letting out a small yell of embarrassment as he pulled the quilted bed top to cover himself, blushing slightly as he looked across at the woman in the doorway, who waved now, giving an almost mocking smile at the boy's actions, idly brushing a few strands of flowing green hair from her shoulders that fell down her back, hugging her rather impressive frame against the white dress she wore. Who are you? Called Naruto, trying to hide his embarrassment as the woman gave a small laugh, moving into the room and taking a seat not far from him, still giving him a slightly annoying smile. It's common to give your own name first, Gaki. Also to be dressed before addressing a lady. Chuckled the woman, her tone slightly mocking but in more amusement than anything else. Still blushing slightly, Naruto looked around the room, spying his cloths folded beside the bed on a small end table. What followed was a rather comical period where Naruto tried to get dressed while keeping himself covered by the blanket, causing him to fall several times, drawing a few chuckles from the green-haired woman that watched him. Finally Naruto was dressed, noting as he pulled on his shirt that the tears and holes seemed to have been patched so that he at least was no longer dressed in rags. Well, that took you some time, though I will admit it was rather entertaining. Chuckled the woman as Naruto gave her a small pouting look that seemed to only entertain her all the more. Well, you could have looked away. Called Naruto as the woman chuckled again. And I could have left you to die on the edge of the desert. I chose to do neither. Chuckled the woman as Naruto paused. You saved me? Asked Naruto, drawing a smile to the woman's lips. That is, did, now your name if you don't mind. Called the woman as Naruto gave her another small pout before speaking. Fine, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Called Naruto as the woman nodded. I see, well Naruto, you may call me CC for now. I have some questions for you, but more importantly I have to know, do you come from the east? Asked the now identified CC, her words catching Naruto slightly off guard. The east? What does she mean? Wondered Naruto as Kyuubi shrugged. Well, you did cross the desert, idiot. These must be the western lands. I remember my father mentioning them once long ago. It's likely you're the first since him to cross over all the way. Remarked the fox as Naruto gave a mental nod looking back to CC who was waiting for his reply. Yeah, I'm from the east. Replied Naruto as CC nodded. I see, and from this, here she held up his shinobi headband waving it slightly, I take it you are a shinobi, correct? Remarked the yellow-eyed woman as Naruto stiffened, his mind already racing. Oh no, if she finds out then she might contact Konoha, they'll come to get me, what am I going to do? Thought Naruto in a rush, the panic in his mind apparently making its way onto his face as the woman let out a small chuckle, tossing him the headband as she pushed herself up. Easy there Gaki, I'm not looking to turn you in or anything, just keep it quiet. Here in the West people like you are rare and I don't want one of those lords showing up to wreak my home just to get to you. Spoke the woman drawing a confused look from Naruto. People like me? He asked, wondering if she could possibly know about the Kyuubi. Yes, you, chakra wielders, here in the West your type is rare, heck I think I've only met a handful of others since I've been alive. Commented the woman idly scratching at her chin as she took a contemplating look. What? No chakra? Asked Naruto as CC shrugged. Well kind of, I mean we all have some, but only enough to do minor stuff, nothing like the stuff we hear the East is capable of, but we get by just fine on our own. We've found a way around the stuff, trust me you don't need chakra to be dangerous here. Spoke the woman giving a small shrug before continuing to speak. Now come on unless you want to spend all day in my back room. You've been down for a few days and I'm not playing babysitter. Commented the woman as she rose turning to leave the room, Naruto trotting along after her, his mind still buzzing with questions of this new land. CC soon showed him her village, nothing too large, but quaint in a way. A few people waved at the pair as they moved around through the squares and markets, Naruto looking around at the villagers. Their dress was a little different to him, a lot like what he'd seen in Wave, but something else was missing. No shinobi, none, he had grown up surrounded by such people, not seeing them here felt well odd. As the day stretched on, Naruto found himself relaxing more and more around this CC woman. She wasn't really overly kind, if anything she acted more like an older sibling to him, openly mocking him, while at the same time teaching him about the western lands he now found himself in. From what she told him, the western lands had once been united under some crazed leader over 100 years ago, who had eventually died at the hands of one of his sons. After that the empire had shattered, forming into feuding lords that fought for the empire's throne, leading to the state of things as they were now. In return, Naruto told CC all about the East, as well as his own life, avoiding speaking at any length about his recent departure. After a time both found themselves back in CC's home, Naruto helping her as she prepared a meal, still chatting ideally as they did. So what now Naruto, far as I can tell you don't want to go back east, and the west isn't exactly the safest place to just be wandering around. Commented the woman as she tipped a few diced vegetables into a pot, looking over to see Naruto chopping some meat, but stopping as she spoke. CC watched as the boy's hands seemed to tremble slightly, holding the knife he had been using, his whole body tensing as his looked down at his hands. Well, what am I going to do? I can't go home, and if I go back into the desert I could really die this time. What am I going to do? Wondered Naruto, shivering slightly before he felt a small warm embrace encircle him. Blinking up, Naruto saw CC's smiling face looking down into his a moment before she reached out to flick his nose. Ow, hey. Started Naruto before CC interrupted him. Well, whatever, you still have to pay me back for all the work saving you, so it's not like I'm sending you away just yet, so stop moping and get back to chopping. Called CC as she let go of him, casting a small smile back as she moved back to the stew, casting Naruto a small look back as she reached it. Hey, that wasn't a suggestion, Naruto, get to chopping. Called the woman as Naruto shook himself slightly, turning to get back to work with a small trace of a smile spreading over his face. Things carried on like this for a few more days, with CC betting Naruto to perform chores around her home, telling him a few things here and there about the West in return for Naruto sharing more about the East and his own life with her. As the days continued on, Naruto found himself smiling again since he had left Konoha. It still hurt for him to remember the village, his friends, but if he couldn't go back, at least it seemed he'd found a home to belong in. It had been a few days since Naruto had begun to settle into a habit with CC that the blonde found himself at the market, his eyes scanning down a list as he moved from stall to stall. Okay, carrots, radish, beef, is that everything? Muttered Naruto. I'm not your private secretary and you forget the beans again. Snorted the fox as Naruto mentally slapped himself, turning back to the opposite side of the market where the groceries were. Darn it, why didn't you tell me earlier? Grumbled Naruto as he set off back the way he came, his tenant chuckling as he marched. Because I like to see you suffer, makes me feel all warm and tingly. Chuckled the fox as Naruto sent a mental glare his way. You're a sadist. Muttered the blonde as the fox chuckled. Just as Naruto was about to fire up with a fresh insult, a whistling above drew his eyes skyward. For a few moments the blonde simply stared into the vast skies until a small black spot that seemed to be drawing closer drew his attention. For a few seconds Naruto just watched the speck trying to figure out what it was, till his eyes went wide in sudden horrible understanding. "Okami, everyone run!" cried Naruto, dropping his bags as he started dashing forwards towards the town square. Around him several people stopped looking towards the boy they had come to know over the past week before looking skyward to try and spot what he had. One by one people froze in horror before cries rang out as what appeared to be several armored figures connected to some kind of bright yellow gliders came into view. As they swooped lower, Naruto spied the armor they were wearing, his heart racing as he recognized a few of the symbols upon it. "Ah, that looks like the armor that Dodo guy from Snow wore, but why is it here?" called Naruto as he saw the small group of flying figures dip down large rectangular cannons in their hands, all trained down upon the village. A second later, with a sound of grinding metal, a storm of metal started to rain down from the airbound figures, sending up a blast of dust and stone as they raced across the square and shops, drawing cries of fear and pain from those below. As the metal began to fly, Naruto's world went red as he leapt upon the side of one building racing up its length, his eyes burning as he focused on the flying figures. One of the airborne assailants was just banking around for another pass when a cry of rage drew his eyes around his mind, freezing as he saw the red-eyed Naruto flying towards him, a swirling ball of purple chakra in one hand outstretched in his hand. The flyer's last sight was that of the swirling orb plunging into his face before his mind went blank. His fellows in the skies turned just in time to see their partner's glider spinning down to crash into the square as they were forced to veer off as a wave of oversized shuriken flew upwards from a blonde youth standing in the village square. As the remaining flyers swerved back into position, their cannons trained on the boy, a series of pops behind them drew their eyes around. A wave of smoke met their eyes as the blade flung towards them exploded into copies of the boy, each now pelting down at them. Before the flyers could manage to avoid them, blonde blurs crashed into their gliders, clawed hand digging into the steel as they impacted. Soon each of the flyers were tumbling down to the ground, their occupants either roaring in anger as they tried and failed to fling the attacking clones off of them, or already silenced by a well-placed kunai. At the same time, Naruto was already moving, leaving the small group of flyers to their fate, his mind racing as he pelted down the road towards CC home, panic tearing at his insides like a ravenous beast. As Naruto came out of the town proper, he turned just in time to see CC's home now ablaze, a great hole torn into its side with several of the same armored figures from the square scattered about, lying motionless around the area, while still others stood around, their cannons pointed outwards, a few taking notice of Naruto as he came into view. Seeing this, Naruto's heart froze. "CC!" cried Naruto, rushing forwards towards the home, the armored figure's cannons tracking over towards the boy, even as he brought his own hand up into a familiar hand sign. Just as the figures were about to open fire, Naruto erupted into a cloud of smoke as a wave of red-eyed blondes exploded into being, all rushing forwards as the armored forces looked on in horror. With howls of fear, the forces began spraying fire into the advancing wave of blondes, kunai flinging themselves into their midst as clones exploded left and right. However, it was too little to stop the tide of Naruto, who swept over the gunners, dragging them down as Naruto shot past towards the home, skidding to a halt as the entrance collapsed in a crash, the flames swallowing it whole a second later. "No, CC!" cried Naruto as his legs went out from under him, his eyes losing their red glow as he watched the flames consume the home. In horror, Naruto watched as the home began to collapse in on itself, his mind struggling to fight what he was seeing, even as a harsh voice called out across from where he laid. "You boy!" cried a bark of a voice, causing Naruto to look around to see a tall armored figure who, like his fellows, wore the grey chakra armor, only his sported a heavy layer of metal plates all along it, making him appear almost like some walking fortress. His face twisted into a scowl barely visible from his armored helm. Naruto, however, didn't respond, his face vacant as he watched his latest home burn. "Naruto! Naruto, damn it, snap out of it!" roared Kyuubi as the great armored figure swept a massive spiked club around, moving forwards towards the stationary boy. "CC, everyone, whyy!" thought Naruto, his world collapsing once again even as the club came roaring down towards him. But the blow never reached him. There was a grinding of metal as the massive weapon was forced back, even as a wide armored figure stepped past Naruto, a long straight blade coming around, flicking through the air gracefully as the armored man let out a howl of pain, a crimson line opening up across his armored chest as he fell back a few steps, cursing. "You!" roared the man, his hand reaching up to try and press his wound closed even as the newest arrival looked down towards Naruto. The boy's eyes had gone wide at what he was now seeing. The figure before him stood in armor as well, only different from what he had seen. For one, it was bright white and more form-fitting, though heavy interlocking plate still covered it, only showing small flashes of black and blue at the joints, where the knees and armored shoulders hung just enough to allow for movement. However, that was not what drew Naruto's eyes, it was the wave of green hair leading up to a familiar face that drew his eyes even as a familiar smirk looked down at him. "Honestly, I send you to do shopping, and here I find you playing with these idiots. I take 1 week away from the lines and you get nothing but trouble. Muttered the armored maiden as Naruto's eyes welled up with tears. CC, he cried as the armored woman gave him a small smirk. Of course, like a little fire would be enough to stop me. I told you that we of the West didn't need chakra to be dangerous. Chuckled CC as she turned, lifting her blade again, its tip pointed towards the armored figures as her eyes flashed dangerously. Naruto followed her movement, his eyes falling upon the long straight blade, unlike the curved blade he had seen in the east, its tip aimed directly at the figure before them. "Bitch, for my lord, you will die here and your pathetic forces will follow," roared the hulking figure as he swung his weapon up one again. Before he could even manage to lift the weapon fully, CC had already moved her figure, almost seeming to vanish into a blur of white as she sprung forwards, her blade outstretched. Naruto watched in awe as she flew forwards, her speed reminding him of what he had seen Lee once accomplish back in his own village. Before the figure could even recognize the attack had begun, it was over, as CC's blade punched clear through his armor, the point forced out his back as a wave of crimson exploded out of him. With a quick flick, the blade was back out and CC had skipped back a few steps, allowing the armored figure to collapse as she turned, still smirking, to see Naruto's stunned face. "What's the matter, Naruto? Never seen a woman fight before, though I suppose I am still incredible to behold," commented the woman, flicking her blade before sheathing it with a sharp snap so that it hung at her side. As she marched back over to where Naruto sat, she was suddenly bowled over as the boy flung himself forwards with enough force to bring her down, his arms wrapped around her as he cried into her armored chest, catching her off guard. I thought you were," managed Naruto between tears as CC sighed, looking down at the boy and moving so that one armored hand rested lightly upon his head, her fingers running gently through his hair. "I understand, but I can't go anywhere yet, beside you still owe me," chuckled CC as Naruto gnawed into her form, not releasing her from his grip. After a time, Naruto had managed to calm himself enough to start asking what was happening. However, before he could get his answers, a small army of armored figures had arrived, all sporting armor more similar to CC's, and rushing to find her. As Naruto watched, he saw them rushing about tending to the injured, while others gathered the weapons and armor of the fallen forces, all under the watchful eye of CC. As the day came to an end, Naruto found himself seated in a large tent across from CC, who had finally removed most of her armor and was now facing him in the same dress she had worn when they had first met. "So I'm guessing you want answers, right?" asked CC as Naruto nodded, causing her to smirk slightly. "I thought so. Well, remember me telling you about those fighting to reclaim the kingdom?" asked the woman as Naruto nodded. "Good, seems you can listen," chuckled CC as Naruto gave her an annoyed look that only seemed to amuse her all the more. "Anyway, I just happen to be the leader of this particular group, you see," started the green-haired woman, gesturing out of the tent towards where a large force of armored figures were milling about. "Then you're trying to take over the country?" asked Naruto as CC shrugged. "I suppose that's one way to put it. Really, I, along with several others, simply became tired of the constant conflicts taking our homes. Most of those out there are from places just like that town, caught up in a war they didn't ask for. For us, the only way to keep from dying for someone else's stupid war is to end it ourselves," remarked CC. As Naruto nodded slightly, looking over at her armor for a moment before looking back to her. "So those guys," he started, "were there to raid the village. It was just bad luck it was where I had gone to recover, just like it was good luck I found you at the edge of the desert," replied CC as Naruto nodded. "See, can I stay with you?" asked Naruto as CC gave him a contemplating look. "I wouldn't be against it, Naruto, someone like you is a game changer for our forces. The major powers have been gathering chakra wielders and forcing them into their armies for a long time. Even I can't take some of them on in a fair fight, and not to brag, but I'm easily the best fighter our forces have," remarked the woman, reaching out to rap lightly against her armor. "Besides, from how you handled those forces, it might just be possible for us to put an end to all of this stupid fighting," spoke CC as Naruto felt a small smirk move across his lips. "You just say that so you can sleep in more," pointed out Naruto as CC gave off a small chuckle. "Maybe so. What do you say, Naruto? Want to help me liberate the West? Who knows, you might even pay off your debt to me along the way," finished CC as Naruto found himself grinning in reply. "I'll do it," called the boy as CC rose. "Well then, let's go and meet the troops. After all, you'll be the first chakra user they've met that hasn't tried to kill them," spoke CC as Naruto hopped up to follow after her and out into the camp. He may have lost his future in the East, but his future in the West was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Talking, thinking, mental conversation. Demon God are the like printed words. Jutsu, Rise of the West. Years and year of conflict. The only life those in the West had known from the time they were born to their deaths, either coming with old age or more commonly coming by being caught up in the flames of war themselves. It had been over 100 years since the ancient times of the first emperor, who had aimed to claim the world itself as his prize. The man had led his country to ruin across as many battlefields as he could find until his final breaths were silenced. What he left behind was a broken land, a warring land. The land Naruto now fought to unite. Inside a large military camp, a tall figure made his way forwards through the tents, men and women halting in their tasks to snap off salutes or calls out greetings that the man returned as he moved among them. As the figure stepped between the campsites, the firelight reflected off of his crimson armor. The layered suit making the man appear as a mobile fortress, tightly packed chakra armor layered threefold before heavy overlocking plates were fitted on top, each layer containing a new wave of seals ingrained into every inch of the metal itself, with interlays of chakra metal for added effect. Despite the layers in play, the armor remained mostly form-fitting, with only the shoulders being slightly extended to hold storage for weapons and scrolls that complemented the armored figure's style. From the rear hung a hilt of a blade that looked as though it belonged to some massive blade, but only sporting the small point to it no longer than a foot. Despite this odd weapon, the armor itself made the figure look all but invincible, which was not far from the truth. In effect, it would take something like an S-rank jutsu to even hope of punching through the armor in a clear shot, and adding the chakra metal on top of that meant that despite its weight, the damage to the man's movement was negligible. The Westerners may not have had the power to fling fire and lightning from their fingertips, but they did hold the mightiest shields ever created. With the combination of chakra metal and seals, the West had found a way to store what little chakra they had into a viable source of power. The chakra armor had simply been the first step. No one outside of the West had seen the like of what now covered the man before them. Through small bits of the Western technology filtering into the East whenever a warlord sought to gain funding for his next campaign, but nothing like what was in play now. As the armored figure stepped past another fire, his armored helm turned, the smooth viewing mask showing a pair of glowing blue eyes that focused upon a few figures as the tail plume colored red like the tail of some fox waved behind the figure, brushing lightly upon his armored form as he made his way over to a long table. Scattered around the table, a few armored figures were in discussion, pointing every now and then to the large map laid out before them. The first was a woman in form-fitting white armor not unlike his own, sporting a small sea of green hair. Noticing his approach, she brought her usual smirk to her lips as she turned to face him. Beside her stood a rather unremarkable-looking youth, his form thin for someone in a military camp, draped only in a formal kimono. However, the brilliance in those purple eyes of his told anyone that he was not the type to do his fighting with force, nor did he need to. Across from the pair stood three others also covered in armor of their own, closer to what their fellow green-haired woman wore, as opposed to the Goliath that the red-armored figure had. The first of these was a young woman, her features delicate, while still holding a power behind them that dared anyone to challenge her. Her hair fell just over her armored shoulders that were the same shade of purple as her hair, except for the black breastplate and touches of gold around shoulders. If one were to watch, they would also notice that she continued to watch the woman to her left as though always on guard around her. The source of her concern was her opposite in only temperament. She looked to be a touch younger than the purple-haired woman. Her own hair would have fallen down like her back like a carpet to her feet if it was not drawn back in a single ponytail of brilliant pink draped over her own white armor, a mirror of the one worn by her green-haired companion. Unlike her fellow, her beauty stemmed from the overflowing happiness that seemed to simply drip from her as her blue eyes traced over to the approaching figure, her mouth turning up in a smile that could melt even the most frozen heart. The final member of the table was a red-haired woman who appeared about the same age as the purple-eyed man across from her own hair cut in short crop that left a few spikes to fall around her face that sported a perpetual look of confidence. Like her fellows, she was draped in armor, but unlike theirs, hers was colored a bright crimson, except for the golden chest plate and small touches upon the arms and legs where color gave way to a darker gray. As the armored man came to halt, it was the pink-haired figure that spoke first. "Naruto-kun, why do you always have to wear that helmet everywhere?" Came a happy voice, turning into a cute pout that drew a few chuckles from CC as the rest watched the figure reach one armored hand up to remove his helm, showing a mess of golden spikes hanging above two bright blue eyes and a rich smile. "Sorry Euphemia-chan, force of habit," chuckled Naruto, setting the crimson helm before him as across the table the purple-eyed man let out a sigh, ideally rubbing at his head. "Euphemia, honestly, this is a war council," muttered the man as the pink-haired girl turned her pouting face towards him in turn. "Oh, drop it, Lelich, she can do as she likes," spoke the woman to Euphemia's left, drawing the man's eyes around her stern face. "Cornelia Onison, you spoil her," sighed Lelich as across from him the red-haired woman snorted, jabbing a figure over at the man, chuckling as she spoke. "Oh, big talk coming from you, Lelich, you let Nunnally get away with murder," called the Redeed, causing the man to flush with embarrassment as those at the table to let out a series of laughs at his expense. "True Colin, but I think that's enough chit-chat for now. Naruto, Lelich has finished outlining the next attack. After our last battle, it looks like they are desperate," spoke CC as Naruto nodded, turning his attention towards the woman who had become like a sister to him over the years. It had been a long road, but Naruto had stayed beside CC as they battled to free the land from the eternal conflict that it seemed trapped in. It had taken years to come to where they were now, but at last they were nearing the end, only one enemy remained before this war could finally come to a conclusion. Right, with our last push we decimated their airfields, even if they managed to get a few gliders up in the air, it won't matter at this point. On top of that Cornelia managed to take out their last heavy chakra wielder, so at this time they only have standard forces remaining. Continued Lelich as he pointed to different areas on the man under the group's watchful eyes. And the supply lines? Asked Naruto looking up as Colin spoke up. We got word from Eve just an hour ago, looks like she and her partner managed to gum it up something special, say what you want, that kid has a talent for this kind of thing. Chuckled Aritid as the rest nodded. Hi, anyway it's all over but the fighting at this point. Though I still say waiting to hear back on our terms is a waste of time, they aren't going to submit. Finished Lelich as Naruto let out a sigh running an armored hand through his hair. As you've said every time I've asked to offered one, honestly Lelich if it was up to you we'd never have prisoners. Muttered Naruto as the purple-eyed man shrugged slightly. If they come to a battlefield they take their lives in their own hands, I simply do not see risking our side's lives for theirs as a winning move. Spoke the man as across from him Euphemia shook her head. Lelich, she began before her brother raised his hands in a sign of surrender. Yes, I know second chances, I'm sorry Euphemia, but I'm a realist. Replied the man as beside the pink-haired woman her fellow laid a hand gently upon her armored shoulder. I know it's harsh, but it's what needs to be done sometime youth. The sooner this ends the sooner things like this won't be necessary anymore. Till then such things need to be done, we only want to make this land one where people like you and Nunnally are safe from being turned into weapons. Finished Cornelia as her sister looked to her for a moment before allowing her head to drop into a nod. Well I suppose there is nothing for it but to wait for the reply for now, our forces are already arranged Naruto. Finished Lelich as he nodded before moving away Colin falling into step beside him even as Euphemia and Cornelia followed soon after them. You know that soft side of yours is going to get you in trouble one of these days, and I won't be there to bail you out. Chuckled CC now moving up in years as she stepped past Naruto rapping lightly on his armored chest as she passed. Hi sensei, I know. Still it gained us some amazing allies wouldn't you say? Smirked Naruto as the green-haired woman chuckled. I suppose it has, and just think pretty soon we can put this war behind us and then nothing but lounging about all day for me and that wonderful baked bread we found. Smiled CC as she moved past Naruto who just shook his head at the woman's words. A lot had changed over the years of conflict, but something still remained the same. Casting his mind back Naruto took a moment to recognize just how much had changed, not least of all himself. -4 years previously, Naruto came running through military camp dodging around armored figures, a few of whom called out to him as he passed them throwing a wave back even as he rushed forwards into the heart of the camp. After a few more misses the blonde boy finally made his way to his destination, skidding to a halt before CC, who turned smirking at his arrival. As Naruto reached her, he finally stopped panting slightly as he looked up into her smirking face. I am done. Breathed out Naruto as CC quirked an eyebrow up. Is that so, managed it already? Asked a woman obviously amused with the state of the teen. In response Naruto nodded before holding out a hand his face turning to one of pure focus as he went very still. For a few moments nothing happened until a low buzz started to sound as wisps of chakra gathered around his palm. After a few seconds the swirling chakra had amassed into a ball of blue chakra as Naruto grinned up at CC. See, I did it. Called Naruto happily as CC nodded. Yep, looks like you actually managed to master your own skill. Chuckled the woman as Naruto shot her an annoyed look letting the chakra disperse as he did. Hey it's not as easy as it looks. Called the boy as the woman chuckled. I suppose not but neither is my training. Still I suppose you kept your end of the deal so I'll do what I can, you start tomorrow. Finished the woman as Naruto threw up his arms a wide grin on his lips. Yes just wait I'm going to be awesome. Called Naruto happily as he ran off back into the camp. Awesome now I can start learning from CC sensei, this is going to be just as powerful as her. Thought the grinning blonde as inside his mind a deep rumbling chuckle answer him. I suppose it's better than watching you train alone, honestly you actually had to be told to master your own skills. Chuckled the fox as Naruto sent him a mental glare. Hey it's not that easy I didn't have a lot of help you know. Shot back the boy causing the fox to snort slightly. I remember, just keep in mind that you're working with me too, I'm not going to die just because you were too weak. Called the fox causing Naruto to mentally smirk. As if you're stuck with me partner. Called Naruto as he rounded a corner getting a snort from Kyuubi in reply. The following days found Naruto being driven into the ground by both CC and the Kyuubi in his training. As CC explained to him chakra users were rare in the western lands. Maybe 1 out of every 100 people were born with enough chakra to make them an effective fighter with it. Thanks to that ceiling was the limit of most chakra use, and even that was mostly limited to protection towards armor or powering some of their creations. Oddly enough, it turned out Kurama was very knowledgeable about seals in general. He said it was one of the few things that the seal had allowed to filter through when he had been held in his previous hosts, just random information, but when the alternative was literally nothing, the fox had taken to learning it, if only to stave off the boredom. Couple that with the physical training that CC put him through, and Naruto was being run ragged nearly every day. In the meantime, the forces were always on the move. To date, a few skirmishes had broken out, but nothing large scale, and CC was careful to keep Naruto back from the lines till he was ready. She explained to him that since chakra users were rare, they were also valuable, and in most cases collected like tools, and then trained to enter into warlords' armies. If Naruto was caught, it was likely he would suffer a similar fate. Still, that didn't mean that chakra wielders were necessarily the strongest warriors either. This was shown to Naruto on several days where he lay panting on the ground after a round with CC, the woman smirking over at him from her position. I don't get it, how can you be so strong without chakra? Managed Naruto, panting as the woman chuckled at him. How? Same as everyone else training, even with our limited chakra our bodies are capable of excelling, and without any abilities to distract us, our only focus can be our styles. In fact, if you ever see a chakra wielder on the battlefield, be sure that they will have a guard with them at least as powerful as myself. Chakra wielders work in pairs, the guard making up for the lacking of the chakra wielder and vice versa. Lectured CC as Naruto blinked up at her from his position on his back. Oh, replied Naruto as he tried to catch his breath. Relax, Naruto, you won't be seeing battle for a long time, not until I say so anyway. Called CC as she pulled her blade from the earth, pointing it at Naruto. Well, get up and go again. She called as Naruto groaned, pushing himself up, Kyuubi laughing at his discomfort. -2 years from that time. Over the years, Naruto found himself steadily becoming a force of destruction, thanks to CC's and Kyuubi's guidance, but even that had not prepared him for the first time he had taken to the battlefield. He would remember it till his dying day, as their forces charged down the hill, armored figures at its base rushing forwards too from some kind of defense before they reached them. Naruto was beside CC, his newly fitted armor gray like the regular forces, but sporting a few more plates like the one CC's armor had, causing it to still feeling a bit heavy as he raced to keep pace with the white-clad woman. The target was a supply convoy headed towards a fortress within the neighboring lord's territory. As they flung themselves down the hill, Naruto's eyes had traced across the convoy as figures rushed here and there trying to prepare before they were engaged. They weren't fast enough. The first lines crashed into one another, CC's forces carving forwards and into the convoy as the crash of metal rang out, accompanied by the occasional explosion or rattle of a kunai launcher went off. Above, their gliders swept past, spraying waves of steel down into the defenders, moments before their own forces overtook them. As Naruto moved ahead, he swung an armored fist around, crashing it into a figure who had tried to bring a kunai launcher to bear on him. With a sickening crash, the man was flung back through the air into a carriage behind him, causing the whole thing to shift and fall, spilling crates that burst to reveal more of the kunai cannons. Focus, Naruto. Called CC as she swung forward, slamming her blade into an armored figure before raising an arm up to protect her face as a wave of kunai shot towards her, glancing off of her armor as she rushed over to attack the shooter. Naruto was about to follow after her when an explosion caught him, flinging him off of his feet and forwards to skid across the earth. As he came to a halt, Naruto turned to fall into a roll, coming up to his feet in time to see the last vestiges of green lightning fading from where it had impacted behind him. Looking up, Naruto was just able to spot a figure standing atop one of the carts that seemed to be moving some kind of green lightning between his fingertips. The figure was dressed in what Naruto could only describe as an armored kimono, his hair spiked back even as the lightning gathered around him, giving him the look of a madman. Before he could even take in what he was seeing, the man had thrust his hands forwards as a wave of lightning larger than any Naruto had ever seen slammed into the earth before him, carving its way towards him. At the last moment, Naruto flung himself out of the way as the wave continued, catching a few unlucky figures in its wake, drawing shrieks of pain from their throats. What the hell? Cried Naruto as inside Kyuubi let out an angry roar. Idiot. Don't question, just fight. Cried the fox as Naruto jerked left, avoiding another trail of lightning, grabbing a kunai launcher and firing a small wave of projectiles up, only to see the figure catch them in another wave of green lightning before flinging them back at him. But how's he doing that? I've never seen chakra do that. Cried Naruto as another wave of lightning rushed past him. Never mind, just close in on him. Cried the fox as Naruto sprang forwards, his hands shifting before a moment later the area was full of armored teens rushing the man. As lightning continued to crash down at him, Naruto waved in and out of the blast, his clones attempting the same, but vanishing as the trails connected with them. Meanwhile, Naruto was already pooling his chakra into an orb of blue and red chakra that hummed in his hand as he raced towards past battling men towards his target, dodging here and there to avoid the odd attack. Eat this. cried Naruto as he finally closed in on the figure, leaping into the air. As he pointed his open palm down towards the figure, the ball of red and blue chakra fidgeting for a moment before blasting off like a cannon. The figure below attempted to raise a defense, but before he could the orb reached him, and with a thunderous explosion the man as well as the card he had been standing atop vanished into blast of smoke and fire. As Naruto dropped back to earth, he was almost too late as a massive blade came swinging around towards him. A heavily armored figure had rushed Naruto the moment he had closed in, only just reaching him as he hung in freefall, unable to avoid the incoming attack. "Shit!" cried Naruto as the blade neared him. With a clang of steel, the blade caught him, cutting into his armor and drawing a strangled cry as he was flung to the ground, skidding as he hit. Looking up, Naruto saw the armored figure now rushing him, his massive sword raised for a second strike. At the last moment, Naruto managed to push himself up, taking the blow on one shoulder and turning it so that the blade sank into the earth beside him, while he brought a swirling ball of blue chakra up to punch into the figure's chest. With a grinning explosion of force, the Rasengan connected, flinging the larger figure back a few steps, but only managing to crack his armor. Staggered but not finished, the armored soldier rushed him again, swinging his blade back just as CC darted past her blade, snapping out in a graceful arc that sent the man's head flying from his shoulder. "Naruto," called the woman, turning to see Naruto holding his side but managing to stand. "I'm okay, just a scratch," managed the blonde as CC watched him for a moment before a few of their forces reached them. "You men escort him back to camp now," called CC. Naruto looked ready to argue, but one look from the green-haired woman was enough to silence those thoughts immediately. Moving back to camp, Naruto spared on last look back to where their forces were just finishing up the battle, the caravan all but finish. It had been his first battle, and despite everything he had done, it had almost been his last. A lesson he would remember. In the present, Naruto found himself blinking back from his memories, his gaze dropping down to the table before him as he scanned the battlefield. After a few checks, Naruto recognized that, as usual, Lilich had thought of everything when it came to these fights. "Honestly, if he was a bit stronger, I'd be scared of him," muttered Naruto as he turned from the table, marching off into the camp. After a small journey, the armored man found himself stepping through the canopy of one of the larger tents, pushing back a flap, allowing the soft light from within to briefly illuminate the darkness outside. As he stepped forwards, it was to move into an open area where a few small tables, as well as chairs, sat about. His eyes slowly dropped from the canvas walls of the tent onto the figures seated around a small table, the smallest of which turned her wide purple eyes to him, an innocent smile playing across her lips that seemed to enhance the simple kindness she embodied. "Naruto-kun," smiled the girl, slowly turning to face him, her waving blonde hair moving only a little in the quiet of the tent. "Hello Nunnally, I hope he hasn't been causing you trouble," replied Naruto, smiling as he saw the young girl shake her head slightly, her hands folded lightly over the simply yellow dress she wore. "Of course not, Kurama-kun was on his best behavior," replied the girl happily as she turned her head over to where the kitsune lay. The red-furred creature was only about the size of a large dog, its 9 tails wrapped gently around it as a soft purring issued from its nuzzle. Every now and then its long rabbit-like ears would twitch, drawing a small giggle from Nunnally. "Honestly, only you could turn him into a house pet," chuckled Naruto as Nunnally grinned up at him, reaching down to the wheels of her chair to help push herself a bit back from the table. "Naruto-kun, that isn't nice. Maybe if you were more polite to Kurama-kun, he wouldn't fight with you so much," lectured Nunnally in her soft voice as Naruto sighed, casting the sleeping fox a glace as he did. "Or maybe you just have a way with stubborn people," chuckled Naruto as he turned to see both Colin and Lilich entering into the tent behind him. "Anaisen, Colin-chan," greeted Nunnally as her brother moved over to greet her, Colin offering a small wave as she moved over to one of the seats near where Kurama lay, throwing small smirk towards the sleeping fox as she did. As the siblings began to chat, Naruto allowed his gaze to slowly shift around his eyes, losing focus as his mind recalled how he had come to be beside these people on the eve of victory. Flashback 2 years. Another battle day, another battle. Naruto had begun to wonder how those among their forces had managed to hold onto their sanity, with this being their norm. Every time they moved from one land to the next, all that met them was more of the same, small villages held in fear, ravaging bands of Sodders, the occasional crazed chakra warrior. Second verse, same as the first. Sighing, Naruto turned from the most recent battlefield, moving over to where CC was finishing a small meeting. As Naruto approached, he spotted an odd sight before him. What appeared to be 4 teens not much older than himself, one obviously older than him, and one young enough to not even come to his waist, were all seated before CC, who seemed to be contemplating what to do with them. "Oh Naruto, good timing," called CC as he stepped forwards, looking from her to the 4 figures who looked just as puzzled to see him there clad in his crimson armor. "These are the children of the last lord we faced in combat, Charles V. Britannia," spoke CC, raising a hand to indicate the figures across from her as Naruto nodded, looking around them from the stern purple-haired girl who was seated at their center, keeping an eye on the younger siblings, particularly the pink and blonde-haired girls that sat beside the only male who was now fixing Naruto with a contemplating look. Okay, but why are they here? I mean, we just kind of overthrew their father, we aren't going to use them as prisoners, are we? Asked the blonde, noticing as he spoke that the male and eldest girl moved closer to their siblings, sheltering them between them, even as CC sighed, shaking her head. No, nothing like that, in fact the three have requested the chance to join us, if you will believe it. Remarked CC as Naruto turned to her, blinking before he reached up to pull of his helm, allowing his golden locks and whiskered cheeks to show for the first time. Really? Asked Naruto brightly as he turned back to face the four, a wide smile plastered across his face as he looked at them. That's great, you're going to help us save the West. Smiled Naruto, the bluntness of his question catching the more protective siblings off guard, even as the younger two looked up to the smiling boy, nodding slightly at his welcoming expression. From across the table, CC let out a sigh, rubbing her forehead lightly as she looked at the blonde teen with an exasperated look. Honestly, you just say yes without even wanting to know more? Asked CC, causing Naruto to look slightly embarrassed as he raised an armored hand up to scratch lightly at the back of his head. Oh right, sorry. So why do you guys want to join? Asked Naruto, turning to the four, the eldest turning her gaze from her siblings to Naruto, her eye meeting his unwavering. Because, unlike our father, neither my brother or I wish to see our sisters turning into living weapons just for someone's ambition. Spoke the purple-haired woman as Naruto blinked at her before shifting his gaze to the younger girls, both of whom looked slightly nervous at his gaze. So you two are chakra wielders, huh? I guess that makes sense, so what can you do? Asked Naruto as both girls looked down, not meeting his eyes as the only male meet Naruto's eyes. What they can do doesn't matter, they don't want to fight. My sister Cornelia and I will join you and fight for you, but we want them kept out of it. Spoke the purple-eyed youth in a tone of authority that caused Naruto to quirk an eyebrow up. Huh? But why, if you want to help stop the war, wouldn't it be better to use what you had? Asked Naruto as the teen's eyes narrowed. Before he could reply to Naruto, the youngest girl shifted to lay a hand gently upon her brother's, looking up at Naruto, her young face simply radiating innocence as she spoke up, her voice soft but shaky all the same. Ifimi and I aren't fighters, she heals people. Whispered the girl as Naruto turned his eyes to the pink-haired girl who nodded slightly. And you? Asked CC, watching as the blonde girl shuddered slightly under her gaze. As she was about to answer, her brother moved, drawing all eyes to him. Lelich? Started Cornelia as the teen shook his head, focusing back on CC and Naruto as he spoke. Nunnely's power is too horrible to use. You remember the Battle of Kabuto? Asked Lelich as both CC and Naruto nodded. It was legend some enemy had been nearly wiped off the map completely, the entire village of Kabuto reduced to nothing but scarred landscape, as though something had simply scooped it clear of the world, leaving nothing behind. As Lelich watched them nod, he drew in a heavy breath before continuing. Our bastard of a father was responsible, he forced Nunnely to use her ability by threatening my death. Whispered the teen as both CC and Naruto looked over to the small girl sitting between her siblings, shaking slightly as tears built in her eyes. I am sorry, I didn't want to. She managed as Euphemia leaned in, pulling her close, even as CC and Naruto looked at one another for a few moments. Very well then, you have my word that I will not force either Nunnely or Euphemia into our forces. For now I'll have someone escort you back into the camp. Colin. Called CC as a red-haired figure moved up around Naruto's own age, giving the group a quick look over as she turned to CC. You boss. Called the girl informally as Naruto chuckled. Colin had joined up after the last village they had liberated. Something of a natural in the art of combat, but lacking a few of the social graces, she had worked her way up the ranking rather quickly and found herself sparring with Naruto more often than not nowadays. Please escort them into the camp and find them quarters. Called the woman as Colin threw up a small salute, moving over to the group. Well, come on, we haven't got all day. Called the redeed as the group stood, Lelich moving behind Nunnely to begin wheeling the girl away, trading annoyed looks with Colin as he did. As the five departed, CC turned smirking to Naruto. Well, we're just collecting beautiful girls left and right, I better watch out or my student's going to become a deviant. Chuckled the woman as Naruto blushed at her words, causing her to laugh as she pushed herself up and moved off into camp, leaving a flustered Naruto behind. Maybe getting yourself a vixen wouldn't be so bad, at least it would be entertaining. Commented the Kyuubi as Naruto shook himself. Oh shut up Kurama-sensei, called Naruto as he turned back into the camp, the massive fox sniggering at his reaction as they moved ahead. As Naruto once again came out of his thoughts, he was just in time to see Kurama stretching himself awake, his long tails billowing out behind him as he stretched himself upon the pillows before blinking around at Naruto with a bored expression. Well, you're late. Chuckled the fox as it moved over to sit beside Nunnely, how reach over to scratch it, drawing a small purr from the fox. At the same time Naruto quirked an eyebrow up at him, adopting a small smirk that Kurama ignored. "Nice try, Gaki, but this feels way too good to be embarrassed about." "Oh right there," called the fox, letting out a happy purr as Nunnally giggled, keeping up her work as Lelich moved over sit beside Colin. "So Naruto, what do you think comes after this?" asked Lelich as Naruto sighed, moving over to take a seat, giving a small shrug as he did. "No idea really, I've just been following CC on this, come on, this isn't even my homeland," replied the blonde as Colin scoffed. "Oh, cut it with that already, if this isn't your home, then what is?" called the retweet as Lelich nodded beside her. "I have to agree with Colin on this matter, Naruto, this land owes you a great debt along with CC, it's your home now," spoke the teen as Colin nodded. "See, even Mr. Know-It-All can't tell you where you belong," called Colin, getting an annoyed look from the teen as Nunnally giggled at the pair's antics. Colin and Lelich had always been like this, at each other over everything. It didn't hurt that Colin was also in charge of getting Lelich into any kind of shape that caused no small amount of tension between the pair. Despite this, as much as neither would admit, they had grown very protective of one another, Colin eventually volunteering to be the guard of Nunnally and Lelich. "Alright, you big idiot, stop trying to live in the past, you've got enough of a future to worry about," said Kurama as he moved over, swatting a tail against Naruto's armor as he moved past him, drawing a small smile to Naruto's lips. "I guess you're right," replied the blonde teen as the rest of the room grinned at him. After a small time Naruto finally left, bidding the three goodbye as Kurama moved beside him, the pair heading out into the camp once again, getting a few waves and more than one solider tossing Kurama a leg of rabbit as they passes. As the pair reached the edge of the camp, they found themselves on the edge of a hillside, looking out over the side of hundreds of campfires all glinting in the moonlight. Thousands of men and women, finally ready to be free, stretching as far as his eyes could see. As Naruto came to a halt, Kurama stopping beside him as he idly chewed on a small bone, looked out as well, chuckling softly to himself. "Have to give you and that CC credit, you make one heck of an army," chuckled the fox as Naruto gave him a small grin. "Hey, couldn't have done it without you, Kurama-sensei," called Naruto as the fox puffed out its chest. "Of course not, I'm the great Kyuubi no Kitsune," called the fox as Naruto found himself chuckling. "Yep," chuckled the blonde as he allowed his mind to flash to the events just a year previously when Kurama had first found himself free of Naruto. Flashback 1 year, Naruto had come back, the most recent battle a little worse for wear, a chakra wielder using flames had managed to catch him off guard while he was busy dealing with his escort. The first blast hadn't made it past his armor, but the subsequent flow of pure fire had managed to slag most of the outer layer. Before things could get worse for him, Naruto had thrown caution to the wind, rushing forwards right into the flames, pushing through to bury a sword into the figure, cutting off the flame, but not before it had managed to punch a hole in his armor, allowing the flames to lick at his unprotected chest. Lying in the infirmary, Naruto groaned as above him Euphemia moved her hands quickly over his wounds, a steady stream of gentle blue chakra flowed down from her palms, seeping into his wounds, causing the skin to stitch itself together, as if by its own accord. "Naruto-kun, what were you thinking?" called the pink-haired girl, small tears pulling in her eyes as she looked down at the whiskered youth who gave her a small pained smile. "Wasn't," he managed as Euphemia shot him an irritated look. "How many times does CC have to tell you, chakra users are dangerous, they aren't like the East. You can't fight them in their element, you have to work around them," lectured the girl as Naruto groaned. "She's right, you know, these people aren't like shinobi, they're one-trick ponies, but monsters all the same. Kind of reminds me of my siblings," remarked Kurama as Naruto gave a mental sigh. I know, but figuring out a way around them in the heat of battle isn't easy. I mean, come on, how was I supposed to know he was a flame wielder?" thought Naruto as the fox chuffed. "Was the massive towers of flame not a dead giveaway?" asked the fox, causing Naruto to concede, simply allowing Euphemia to complete her work. Kurama was right after all, the West may lack all the tricks of the shinobi world, but one thing they had was power. Just take Euphemia here, probably couldn't beat a genin in fight, but give her a patient and she put even Tsune to shame when it came to healing. As Naruto was considering this, a small pang drew his attention back to his stomach as an odd tingling slowly spread across him. "What the? Hey Kurama, what is that? Kurama. Hey Kurama," called Naruto inside his head, only to be greeted with silence. Just as Naruto was becoming worried, he felt an odd tugging sensation, looking down to see Euphemia letting out a small start as something reddish-orange slowly pushed itself out of Naruto's now healed stomach before flopping over onto the ground beside his bed. Both teens stared dumbstruck as the thing, whatever it was, stirred several bits of its moving around slowly as a familiar tone issued from it. "Ow, what the heck hit me?" muttered the thing, slowly rising and turning to face the two who blinked down at it, shock written clearly across each of their faces. What they were looking at was, well, for Naruto at least, unmistakable. A mini Kurama was looking at him, looking just as confused as him at his new perspective. For a few moments none of the three moved before Euphemia let out a small noise, drawing both Naruto's and Kurama's eyes around to see her eyes sparkling like Christmas had come a day early. "Away," called the pink-haired girl excitedly scooping up the fox much to its irritation as Naruto just watched the event play out completely lost as to what he was seeing. It had taken them a while to figure out just what had happened to the fox. From what they could figure given Euphemia's abilities for healing, she had just accidentally completed her work a little too well, in healing not only Naruto but Kurama as well. The seal it turned out was not meant to contain the full Kyuubi, and so instead of simply breaking, it had melted away absorbing itself into the fox and allowing the Kurama they now saw to plop out fully formed once again. However, thanks to the seal he was still linked with Naruto, half of his chakra still contained within the teen. Still with nowhere else to go, and having, despite himself, grown rather fond of the boy he had decided to stay and just see how this war played out. Besides getting to tear apart the battlefield every now and then was rather appealing to the chakra fox when he wanted to. Flashback end. On the hilltop Naruto found himself smirking over at Kurama as his mind recalled everything that had led him to this point. His old life in Konoha, the betrayal, his rescue by CC, the battles and battles following that, and now here he was. Here at last it was coming to an end. So Kurama, what are you going to do once this war's over? Asked Naruto looking down to the fox who gave him an are you serious look before letting out a snort looking away. Not a chance Gaki, I'm not going anywhere. CC's right about one thing, a lifetime of relaxation and rabbit is my future, and don't you forget it. I'm not going anywhere while that's on the table. Replied the fox smirking slightly as Naruto nodded. I suppose not thanks furball. Finished Naruto as the fox gave him a small look shaking his head. No problem meatbag. As dawn rose the next day the first rays stretched slowly across the great plains of the Western Empire, banishing shadows as it raced across the wide expanse. In its course the new warmth fell upon the still figures lining the fields. The light catching off of the metal of their armor sending flashes of light back into the sky. Thousands of them stood upon the field, the dew of the morning hanging from a few of their helms or dripping from the ends of their sheaths now barren of their blades. Their armor shining a vibrant charcoal, even as a few dotted notes of white were spaced among them sporting heavier armor than their fellows, along with what appeared to be folded wings like the golden gliders of the Air Force. At the head of the four stood a line of heavily armored figures carrying towering shields of iron and steel, inscribed with a tapestry of seals, all glowing faintly in the new day sun. From these ranks 3 figures stepped forwards each dressed in full battle gear, their figures striking a startling impression beside the massive force arrayed behind them. At the head of the 3 was Naruto, his red helm turning to look down the line as the fox plum waved out behind him in the steady breeze of the day. Behind him stood the armored form of Cornelia, her rich purple and black armor setting her apart as her own armored helm turned scanning the field, her eyes flashing from behind the crossed visor as the points of her helm struck out on either side, giving her the impression of some kind of ancient demon of the battlefield. Across from Cornelia stood the final figure, her own helm fixed forward shifting slightly as an audible popping came from her neck. Colin blazing blue eyes tracing past the smooth gray face mask of her armor as it looked around, the large gray clawed gauntlets flexing slightly as she looked across at the gathering forces. So I guess they don't wish to surrender. Called Colin looking over to Cornelia as she hefted up a massive golden lance in one hand, drawing a blade similar to CC's with her other. Then they are fools, we haven't come this far to let such as them stand in our way. Called the woman as she turned to see Naruto's armored hands reaching up to grasp the hilt of his own blade, yanking it free to point out towards the forces now massing before them. No we haven't, today we end this. Called Naruto as with a pulse of chakra the metal of his blade sprang forwards, extending into an elegant yet massive blade, standing nearly the man's full height. As Naruto readied his blade from a ways off a massive roar coated the battlefield as the full monstrosity that was the Kyuubi stepped forwards, its tails waving into the air, even as it let out another earth-shaking roar. Instead of causing fear among the forces around it, the men and women instead raised their own voices in cheers and roars of their own. As the call went up armored figures leveled kunai cannons, a few drawing blades of their own to complement the launchers, each pointing forwards towards the last remnants of resistance to their dream. Well can't have Kurama showing me up. Called Naruto as his hands fell into a familiar sign. With a blast the area before the army was suddenly full of identical red-armored Narutos, each brandishing a blade, their fox tails waving like the tails of the massive fox himself, as they all raised their blades, their voices calling out in a roar of their own as they charged. As soon as the red sea of armored figures started, Kurama let out another roar, as blasts of blackened chakra began to fly forwards towards the enemy ranks, even as Cornelia, Colin and the rest of the army rushed forwards following after Naruto's lead. From above the battlefield CC stood watching as the boy she had saved from the desert led the final charge, his forces following him happily as beside her Euphemia and Nunnally watched, their faces showing both concern and pride at what they witnessed. Behind them Lelich also watched, smiling slightly as he watched the forces moving after his friend. The observer saw the enemy troops lowering their own launchers as a rattling of fire began to fill the air, even over the din of the charging forces, hundreds of the red Narutos disappearing into clouds of smoke, even as still more continued forwards closing ground. Then they were among each other as the full brunt of their forces crashed into them. As Naruto reached the line, his first swipe took 3 enemies with it, drawing a cry from their fellows as they spun to levy their cannons upon the armored figure. Before they could manage it, Naruto was already pushing forwards, his blade cutting a furrow in the ground as he raced ahead, his free hand flashing out as a wave of kunai flew out, catching more gunners as the blonde cut his way still deeper into the enemy ranks. But the heave Naruto brought his blade around once again, catching another figure full in the chest as the whistling wind chakra swirling around the blade allowed it to cleave clear through the man in one swing like cannon fire. Before that body could even fall, the red-clad blonde had allowed the swing to pull him around as his free hand rising to show a swirling ball of deep red chakra forming in it. As he came to face into the heart of the enemy again, his hand shot forwards, the black orb buckling for a moment before blasting out, caving its way through the forces till it exploded into a plume of fire, sending enemies scattering even as the first of Naruto's forces passed him by. Looking ahead, Naruto saw as Colin flung herself into a group of gunners who had managed to take down a few of their forces, her claws dancing out as cutting into the enemy forces, sending trails of crimson up from each impact. As the gunners fell from their ranks came a massive armored figure barreling down on the smaller Colin, who swung to meet the target. As the figure reached her, the redhead threw herself forwards under the massive swipe of an axe, her hand slamming into the armored chest, doing little more than denting it, drawing a cry of victory from the armored figure as he drew back a hand to crush her. His celebration ended as Colin triggered the seals upon her palms as a wave of burning metal sprang free of the storage seal, rocketing forwards like a molten lance into the man's chest, causing him to howl in pain as his armor distorted from the wound a moment before he fell back dead. On her other side, Cornelia was also felling forces one after another, her sword flicking out between the enemies, cutting them as though they were but grass. As Naruto watched, the purple armored maiden took a blast of kunai fire that sent her blade flying free from her hand. This, however, proved to be little more than a distraction, as with a jerk Cornelia's golden lance shot forward, spearing another gunner before she closed in, ripping the cannon free from the figure's grip to spray a line of fire into his fellows. Even as with a jerk, she dislodged her lance pointing forwards as around her armored figures rushed forwards into the fray. But Naruto, his gaze shifted forwards to where he saw the commander's group starting to pull back from the fray. "No, this ends here," roared Naruto as he flung himself forward, swiping a hand forwards, sending another solider flying back. His armored chest caved in, even as Naruto pushed forwards towards the retreating force. But even as he felled 2 more solders, he could already see that he would not reach them in time. They were going to escape. Or so it seemed before the towering form of Kurama smashed into the rear of their forces, his massive tails lashing out, sending figures flying and causing the commander's guards to halt, recoiling from the creature's assault. That momentary pause was all Naruto needed as he pushed himself past the final line, grasping his blade in both hands as chakra swirled around him, seeming to bleed off of his armor like an actual cloak that billowed out behind him, making him appear as though a second crimson beast upon the battlefield. As the lord turned back towards the forces, it was just in time to see the crimson armored figure leap, the chakra billowing out behind him in a mix of crimson and blue waves like some massive cape, even as his blade rose above him. As the blade fell, cries began to spread as the enemy forces began to fling down their arms, fleeing from the onslaught or simply dropping down, hands raised in surrender, praying to receive mercy. At the same time, Colin and Cornelia pushed through the line, skipping to a halt as the sight before them opened up. Standing in an open patch was Naruto, his chakra cloak swirling around him, waving gently as his armored form turned towards them, his blade clutched in one hand, the bodies of his final enemy at his feet along with his guard. As the two watched behind where Naruto stood, Kurama rose, his tails waving out like Naruto's own plum in the morning light as he let out a triumphant roar, the soldiers following suit as they cheered the end of their war. The end of lives of fear and the birth of the United Empire. As Naruto turned to face the pair, he allowed the chakra to slip away from him, the cloak shimmering before fading as he stepped forwards, his blade shrinking as he slung it onto his back, looking between the pair as he approached. "So it's over," managed Naruto, his voice a little stunned as he looked around at the forces as they flung down their arms in defeat. Across from him, Colin shrugged as she replied, "I suppose now what?" Her words causing Cornelia to look between the two before letting out a sigh. "Honestly, do I have to do everything? Gather the medics, prisoners are to be disarmed, someone get me a status report," called the woman, turning from the pair and marching back to the forces as several snapped out salute before rushing to obey her, even as cheers continued to ring out around them. "Really, you think she could manage to be happy?" muttered Colin, looking over to Naruto, who let out a small chuckle that soon grew into a deep laugh that carried across the battlefield. After all, he'd now gone from a boy banished from his home to a solider that helped to unite a nation. In all his years dreaming in Konoha, he could never have imagined something even close to as amazing at what he now felt. So he stood there for a time just marveling at what his life had brought him. Till Cornelia yelled at him to shut it and get back to work at any rate. Following the final battle, the United Forces returned to the capital city, once abandoned but now brimming with new life. It had been captured by their forces years previously and had finally been restored to its previous glory that surpasses even the combined capitals of the East in its magnificence. Everywhere one looked there was celebration as people celebrated their loved ones' return or toasted those lost, all to bring the freedom from conflict they had so long fought for. In the heart of the city stood the pillared palace fully restored to its previous majesty, its walls rising up over luscious gardens and buildings, guards standing at attention here and there, armor gleaming white with crimson slashes in honor of their leader's victory. Behind the massive walls through the pillared arcades and inside the massive throne room, its walls covered in hanging tapestries, a rather amusing argument was taking place among a group standing inside the entrance hall, upon the wide marble floors. "What? No, you do it. It was your idea," called Naruto, pointed toward CC, who waved him off. "Not a chance, told you I'm retiring, I'm thinking of just setting up shop at the local hot springs, or maybe buy a restaurant as well, that sounds nice," spoke the woman as Naruto turned to his fellow companions. "What about you, Euphemia?" "Nunnally?" asked Naruto, a note of pleading in his voice, as both women gave him small smiles, shaking their heads. "Sorry Naruto-kun, but we have other responsibilities," spoke the pair as Naruto narrowed his eyes. "Playing with Kurama and spoiling him are not responsibilities. The hell they aren't, that's important work," called the fox, drawing a few giggles from the princesses as Lelich stepped forwards. "I suppose he started before Colin moved up, grabbing his ear and dragging him back. "Oh no you don't, you become leader and you'll get assassinated by a stiff breeze, toothpick," called Colin, causing Lelich to glare at her, while the others chuckled. Cornelia stepped forwards to stand before Naruto, giving him a stern look. "Just face it, Naruto, you are the only choice, the people love you, the soldiers respect you, and would follow you into hell itself if you asked. We saved this land, and now it's time to keep it that way, so shut up and do the job," finished the woman as Naruto looked at her, his gaze slowly shifting to each of the figures in turn, all offering small smiles or nods till finally Naruto let out a heavy sigh. "I don't get a choice in this, do I?" asked the blonde as across from him CC shook her head. "Nope, remember you owe me one, consider this payment, I saved you, and now you look after my home, I think that's fair enough," spoke the woman as Naruto turned to her, his own lips turning up in a small smile. "You planned this, didn't you?" he asked as CC shrugged. "Maybe, I prefer to think of it as betting my future on you, and you haven't disappointed me, Naruto," replied the woman as Naruto nodded. "Well, I guess I can't start now," he replied, turning so that he faced the group as a whole. "Alright, I will become Emperor of the United West, but you better stay to help," finished the blonde as those near him nodded. Soon enough the word spread as the lands united in celebration at the beginning of the reign of the Crimson Emperor of the West. Chapter 3. Talking, thinking, mental conversation. Demon God or the like printed words. Jutsu. Rising tensions over the Great Divide. 2 years since the rise of the United Empire. "You know, I almost prefer the war to this," muttered a blond man as he leaned back in his chair, looking over to see a dog-sized kitsune laying across from him, giving him a bored look before opening its jaw in a wide yawn. "Sorry, what was that? Sounded like more whining," smirked Kurama as Naruto sighed, setting down his pen, idly cracking his neck as he did. Yeah, I get it," muttered Naruto as he pushed himself up from his desk, allowing the light from the window behind him to drop over his white uniform, a cross between military garb and a robe, with a deep burnt crimson that reached down to his feet. The mix of black and crimson gave him an intimidating appearance that stopped at his whiskered face, that held the same compassion he had known as a child upon it. "I'm going to take a break, okay, a few clones can handle the rest from here," called Naruto as a few puff of smoke announced his copy's arrivals that moved over to handle the last bits of the addendum. Looking around, Naruto's eyes moved over the wide window that looked out into the courtyard, spying a few figures below moving around the garden, a smile coming to his lips as he saw a few children rush by. "Looks like Euphemia let the local children into the gardens again, Eve's going to have a fit if they mess of Wally's work," chuckled the boy to himself as he moved out of the office and into the carpeted halls, Kurama trotting along behind him, chuckling to himself. "When is she not having a fit? I swear, for someone with so few emotions she sure has mastered anger," replied the fox as Naruto nodded. "I suppose," replied the blonde as the pair turned down another corridor, passing a few armored guards who snapped off a salute that Naruto returned with a smile that the guards returned. "My emperor, Lady Euphemia has," he started as Naruto waved him off. "Invited every child she could to play in the gardens, I saw. I swear we need to find her a husband before she starts kidnapping kids for herself." chuckled Naruto as the guard smiled, nodding as the emperor continued on down the passage, descending down a wide circular staircase until he found himself at the entrance to the gardens, just in time to see a few children rush by, followed by a laughing Euphemia. "And there she goes," called Naruto as a figure stepped into his line of sight a few yards away, drawing the blonde's attention. The figure was around Nunnally's age, dressed in what could only be described as a gardener's uniform, consisting of baggy brown overalls that was combined with a bright green shirt that showed a few touches of dirt. As Naruto turned to face him, the figure turned to him, his red eyes focusing on Naruto for a moment before his face broke into a wide grin, his arm rising above his brown bangs in a happy wave that Naruto returned, smiling softly, moving over as he did. "Well, Wally, how's the garden?" asked Naruto, smiling as the boy smiled happily, waving a hand gently around as every flower opened as if of one mind. From around the pair, the excited cries of children rose as they rushed around in the blooming garden, bringing a smile to Wally's face as he turned back to Naruto, nodding happily. "I see, wonderful as ever, you really have a gift, you know that," smiled Naruto as the brown-haired boy nodded excitedly as another presence drew his eyes around as another figure approached. She was almost the direct opposite of Wally in every way possible, her form pristine white, right to her hair, while her blue eyes flashed as she focused them on Naruto, the wind catching her hair and blowing it gently over the wide armor she insisting on wearing, as well as the holsters strapped to her waist. "Hello Eve, you look well," smiled Naruto as the woman nodded to him, moving over to stand close to Wally. "Yes Emperor, I am well," replied the girl in a voice that was almost devoid of any emotion. "Just thought I would compliment Wally's work, thank you again for looking after him," replied the blonde as the white-haired woman shook her head slightly. "There is no need for thanks Emperor, I would do it without the request," replied the woman as beside her Wally gave her a smile, moving over to take her hand in his, even as his lips parted. "Eva," he managed, drawing the woman's eyes around to him as he gestured towards the garden, starting to move off, the woman following behind. As they moved away, Naruto's eyes fell upon the scar running across Wally's throat for a moment before he shook himself of the image. "It's not your fault he was experimented on. Those were the times back then with chakra users here. Just be glad that his guard cared more for him than she did for her lord," commented Kurama as Naruto let out a breath, nodding as he watched a brown-haired boy wave a hand as a brilliant blue rose emerged from a bush, quickly finding its way into Eve's hair, causing the smallest hint of red to touch her cheeks as Wally smiled at her. "You're right, besides I have enough to worry about," replied Naruto as the two made their way past the gardens. As they rounded the grounds, a call drew their attention around as Lelich approached in his formal robes, a few figures Naruto recognized as his council beside him. "Lelich," greeted Naruto as his friend moved over, giving him a small smirk. "Dodging work again Emperor," replied the man as Naruto gave a grin. "Never, so what can I do for you?" asked the Emperor as the two made their way forwards, the council following behind at a small distance to give the two some privacy. "I just received a report from our first ambassador to the east. It seems that what we heard was true, the nations are still united after that conflict a year ago," spoke Lelich as Naruto nodded. "I'm actually impressed, one would think that without a common enemy they would have already turned on one another," replied Naruto as Lelich nodded. "One would think, but I guess some things last longer than you would expect. But apart from that, our ambassador reported he couldn't get a meeting with any of the daimyos. Seems they didn't believe the West was actually united," continued Lelich as Naruto nodded. "Now that I believe, I suppose it was too much to hope they would take our word for it, so what does that leave us? Opening up trade to the east means we have to have some recognition?" asked the blonde as Lelich gave a small smile. "Well, proof obviously, it just so happens a tournament for the anniversary of their victory is being held in a few months, and it is open to anyone," finished the purple eyes man, giving a wicked smile. "You know you look evil when you smile like that," remarked Naruto as Lelich shrugged. "I suppose, Kami knows Colin tells me as much daily," muttered the man, drawing a small smile from Naruto. "So who do you suggest we send?" asked Naruto as the two continued around the corner discussing their plans for the upcoming tournament. At the same time, across the world inside the Land of Fire, another blonde figure was having much the same discussion with a group of figures. Within the Hokage's office sat Tsunade behind her large wooden desk piled high with scrolls, her eyes looking across to the group before her as she let out a small sigh. "Are you sure you won't reconsider? This tournament is to honor everyone who fought and died in the war. We only managed to defeat Akatsuki thanks to everyone's aid. It would do help the village greatly if you would agree to go and represent us," spoke the woman, her brown eyes looking between the pair that stood before her. "Except neither of us care to represent this place, Tsunade, and you know very well why," spoke the first figure, a tall blonde man sporting sapphire blue eyes. Beside him the other gave a small nod, gently adjusting the child in her arms that was even then reaching playfully at a strand of her crimson hair. "Enough Tsunade, you know damn well what our answer was before you asked, so what's this about?" Asked Aridit as Tsunade turned her brown eyes to meet the woman's violet ones, letting out a sigh as she did. You're right Kushina, I'm sorry. It was a request from the council, and don't worry they can't force either of you to go. Replied Tsunade as across from her Minato and Kushina Namikaze nodded. Good, maybe if you'd had that attitude a few years ago you'd have more of our support. Snapped Kushina as beside her Minato sighed laying a hand on the woman's shoulder as he saw Tsunade flinch away from the Redeed's words. Kushina-chan. Whispered Minato as the Redeed looked to him before allowing her anger to slip from her turning slowly back to Tsunade even as the bundle in her arms let out a small happy gurgle. Sorry Tsunade that wasn't fair. Whispered Kushina as the Hokage shook her head. No, it was Kushina. Just forget it. Replied Tsunade as she looked back at the two who stood before her in defiance of death itself. It was still almost impossible to believe that it had happened. As the elemental nations had united to face off against the Akatsuki's forces, the Edo tents had been flinging the dead back at the united shinobi forces from the beginning to the end. Among them had been the fourth Hokage and his wife, both of whom had arrived near the end, luckily only resulting in limited damage. Then when they had pushed the leaders of Akatsuki all the way back that falling out had happened, some orange-masked guy going for the red-haired one, and that paper user taking the strike instead. After that all hell had broken loose as the orange-haired figures had rushed the masked man practically tearing him to pieces before the red-haired man pulled out some kind of jutsu they still couldn't understand. All over the battlefield the injured and dead alike had suddenly arrived, hearts beginning to beat again after they had stopped forever, and possibly most shocking, as the remaining revived fighters letting out howls as they were stripped of their immortality, their bodies returning to life dropping them back into the world they had long departed. Among them had been the pair that stood before her now. At first it had been like a dream the dead returning to life, but as the fighting ended, Tsunade was faced with the horror of explaining to the parents that their son Naruto was missing. It hadn't taken the parents long to get the truth out of the Hokage horrified at the village's actions and that they had driven their son to become a traitor. It had taken everything that Tsunade had to just keep the pair from killing the rest of the clan heads for their actions. Some had even foolishly believed that Minato would take back his stance as the Hokage those hadn't lived very long. The pair had moved into a small home on the outside of the village. At first they had considered leaving, but even they knew that there was really nowhere to go and the best chance of finding their son came with staying in the village. They had become mostly reclusive only speaking to a select few and accepting work only on their terms as they continued to search for any trace of their son to give him the home he had deserved to have. The one bright spot being the birth of their son a year before the little blonde boy had become their world even as they searched for his brother. Across from the pair Tsunade sighed as she shuffled a few papers on her desk, offering a small smile as the violet eyes of Menma peeked up above the bundle, letting out a small happy cry at seeing her. Well then, now that I have your answer I suppose I just have to ask if you want to come to the tournament with me. Get out of the village for a time. Asked Tsunade as the pair looked at one another for a few moments before both smiled. Hi Tsunade that sounds nice. Replied Minato as Tsunade nodded. I'll make sure to give you the information, for now I have to get back to picking our representative. Replied the woman watching as the three disappeared in a flash of yellow light, leaving the woman alone once again as she looked down to a photo showing a smiling blonde boy waving happily up at her. You better be out there Gaki whispered Tsunade as a few flecks of moisture dropped from her eyes. It had been almost 6 years now and not even a whisper had been heard of the boy. Most wrote him off as falling to the Akatsuki at some point, while others said he died in Odo during the war when the Akatsuki had destroyed the traitor Orochimaru, but for some reason Tsunade just couldn't accept that. Something told her that he was alive somewhere. Meanwhile a few weeks later in the Western Empire, Naruto was seated across from four figures, idly rubbing his head as he went through the subject for what felt like the 100th time. Look they aren't going for a vacation, they are going to represent our empire, so we can hopefully have some kind of positive relation with the Eastern world. Spoke Naruto as he looked across to where Nunnally and Wally sat both nodding. We understand Naruto-kun, but if Eve and Colin are going to participate in the tournament then we want to go to cheer them on. Spoke Nunnally as beside her the brown-haired boy nodded in agreement causing Naruto to sigh as he looked over to Colin and Eve for help. Unfortunately for the young lord he found none waiting for him. What's the big deal, you yourself will be there, so the more people you can trust present the better, right? Asked Colin as Eve gave a small nod. Where I go Wally goes. Spoke the white-haired woman matter-of-factly as she looked at the emperor. Naruto allowed his eye to drift between the four before him for a few more moments before he raised his hands in surrender. Okay, you win. But you do realize that leaves Lelich and CC in charge of this country. I'm worried Cornelia and Euphemia won't be able to keep them in line. After all they're headed to oversee the forward bases during this time smirked Naruto as Colin waved a hand dismissively. Oh relax he won't pull anything. Chuckled Colin as beside her Nunnally nodded as beside her Kurama raised his head up looking around. Besides Kurama-kun can look after them. Smiled the blonde girl as the fox gave a small smirk that caused Naruto to shiver. "Oh, I feel so much better," grumbled the man as the rest of the group chuckled at his reaction. Not long after found Naruto standing before an airship like the ones he had seen once in his travels to Snow. Turns out that most of the stuff that guy had been using was bought from the West. In hindsight he supposed that was reasonable, after all it always did strike him as odd that something like chakra armor just sprung up in the East and then wasn't heard from again. Shrugging to himself Naruto turned to see CC watching him, dressed in a simple white dress, idly eating a piece of that baked cheese bread she seemed to enjoy so much. "Come to see me off?" asked Naruto looking around at the woman who gave a small shrug before she pulled out his red helm from behind her back, tossing it into the blonde's hands, causing him to look down at it before turning back to her. "You can fool the others, but I know you're worried about going to the East, just keep your face covered and tell them to keep your name quiet. Remember that you aren't that boy I picked up from the sands anymore, you're our emperor, so act like a K." Called CC as Naruto gave a small smile pulling the helm into place as he nodded towards his sister figure. "Thanks, and don't worry, I'll do what's right for my country no matter what," called Naruto as the green-haired woman nodded, giving him a parting wave as she turned back from the airfield, leaving Naruto to look back towards the ship, his mind moving slowly over his times in the East once again. Ever since he'd agreed to go through with this plan he'd been thinking about the East, about his first home. "I wonder what's become of everyone. No, I suppose it doesn't matter, CC's right, I'm not that boy anymore. Besides, it's not like I have anyone that would miss me, well aside from Granny. I suppose Shino and Hinata might, but they probably believe whatever story Jiraiya made to cover up his attack. Still, it would be good to see some old friends. I wonder how Gaara's doing. I guess I'll just have to see what life has in store for me like always." Finished Naruto, his thoughts drawing to an end as the signal for departure rang out, causing him to turn back towards the ship moving forwards as his robes waved behind him, along with his foxtail plume. Soon enough Emperor was aboard and the ship was off sailing through the skies towards the elemental nations. At the same time across the world a group was moving out of Konoha as well, headed for Suna where the competition would be held this year. At the head was Tsunade, followed after by the Namikazes, as well as the Rookie 9, along with Team Guy and their senseis, the youths having grown into their skills during the war and now representing the best that the village had to offer. It had been quite the shock for them when they first learned of the truth behind Naruto's parentage, but in the end it had done little for them. In their eyes Naruto was what he had been before, a traitor to the Leaf and to them. Only one of the group still fully believed in Naruto's innocence, the same girl who had learned to believe in the impossible that the boy represented when he was just a brave child that refused to leave her to be bullied by some boys in a park. Hinata Hyuga had grown over the course of the conflict, but since Naruto had left the village she had slowly drifted from the rest of the Rookie 9, as well as her own family, as Neji returned to his old ways after Naruto's betrayal. His memory view shifting to anger that despite everything Naruto had not been willing to make the same sacrifice his father had for other, casting him as a coward in the boy's eyes. So in solitude Hinata had continued to hope that her first love was safe wherever he was. As she had moved steadily from her team and as the suspicions on Naruto shifted from worries and whispers to fact, the Pale Eyes girl found herself truly alone. Her only solace had come with the return of the Namikazes. The parents had grown close to Hinata as she told them of the amazing boy that their son had been, without the stigma of the village or the belittlement that came from the shinobi and his instructors. Even Kakashi had not been immune to this, expressing his sorrow for his sensei's loss, but making it clear that Naruto's betrayal was inexcusable all the same. That particular comment had landed the man in the hospital, and he had not dared to stay in Kushina's presence for more time than absolutely necessary since then. So as the group set off for Suna, Hinata found herself looking out across the village, wondering if this time she might find even a hint of her blonde hero's whereabouts. A few days later found the forces of Konoha arriving at the gates of Suna before being cleared to enter the village, more than one glancing around at the massive coliseum constructed outside the walls for the competition, as well as something else that stuck out among the sandy dunes. "Hey, isn't that Dodo's ship?" called Sakura, pointing towards where a massive airship sat, its sides covered in layers of white sheets embroidered with a curious symbol that looked like some kind of red bird flying off into a sunset. As the rest turned towards what Sakura indicated, a huff from her left drew her eyes around to where Sasuke stood in his Anbu age, having shaped him over the years, though he kept the same distinguishing features. "Hi, that looks the same, but I don't recognize the symbol," remarked the Uchiha as the rest nodded in agreement before a voice belonging to Asuna-Chunin spoke up. "Yeah, none of us knew what to make of it. Some people claiming to be from the United West showed up in it for the tournament. They were dressed in armor like some kind of samurai too, weird if you ask me," remarked the man as the rest looked at one another. "I heard that someone claiming to be from the West came to see the Fire Daimyo some weeks back, but that's ridiculous. The West hasn't been around since the first Shinobi War and the Village of the Skies," remarked Tsunade as beside her Kushina gave her a look of comprehension. "Wait, Sky? Weren't they the ones who tried to take over the entire elemental nations?" asked the Redeed as beside her Minato nodded. Hi, that was them, but they were wiped out a century ago, nothing's been heard from them, since what are they doing here now? Muttered Minato as he moved slightly closer to Kushina. From behind them the remaining Konoha forces gave the ship a final distant look before allowing themselves to filter into the village. Meanwhile inside the village Naruto, his armored helm sitting upon his brow, walked beside Colin as the Redeed pushed Nunnally forwards through the streets, Wooly and Eve deciding to stay on the ship for the time being while the others moved about the village. This place really is different, I mean, it's practically bleeding chakra. Commented Colin looking around in wonder as Nunnally nodding in agreement as they saw a pair of Kiri shinobi pass them by, giving the three a small glance before moving on without comment. Hi, this is just one of the villages, here in the east there are 5 major ones and a few smaller ones, but they are all a little alike. Remarked Naruto as the two women nodded. The group had arrived only a day before, causing a small stir as the ship sat down, Gaara himself arriving to greet them. Naruto had almost blown his cover at seeing his old friend having achieved his dream, but held it in playing the part of an emperor first and explaining their arrival. After a small discussion, Gaara had welcomed them, and at this moment they were on their way to meet with him in order to discuss possible trade with the Wind Daimyo. Soon enough the three had arrived at the Cage's building, being welcomed in and led quickly to his office. As their guide was about to knock announcing their arrival, a small smattering of voices caused her to halt as the three from the west also paused, looking over to the door a moment before it swung open. Thank you Kazuki-san, we will go and get settled, thank you for your time. Spoke Tsunade as she turned to leave Shizune as well as the Namikazes and Hinata beside her. As the Konoha group turned they came face to face with a delegation from the west, both groups pausing, but for different reasons. On the journey Naruto had explained to the forces of his past in greater detail, Colin and Nunnally had of course already known, but above all he stressed the importance of avoiding Konoha if at all possible, and here they had practically run over them. On the other side the Konoha forces looked ahead, their eyes moving from the armored form of Colin, only missing her gauntlets and helm, to be complete over towards the armored helm of Naruto, and finally to the chair-bound Nunnally in her simply yellow dress. Oddly enough it wasn't the armored pair that drew their attention, but rather the chair-bound girl who was even to the least sensitive sensor practically dripping with chakra that would put some cages to shame. For a tense moment the two sides watched one another until of all things the little bundle that was Menma gave a happy squeal, waving his hands towards the three, giggling happily, drawing everyone's eyes. Menma-kun, whispered Kushina, shifting her hold on the child, attempting to quiet him as across from them Nunnally let out a small smile, nodding to the group. We apologize, we were not aware the Kazuki was occupied. Spoke Nunnally with the mannerisms of a true lady of the court. Her words seemed to snap Tsunade out of her rut as she turned to the chair-bound girl, offering a smile of her own. No need, we were just finishing. Replied the blonde as she looked across the three again before continuing. I am Tsunade Senju, Hokage of Konoha, and these are my companions Kushina, Minato, Hinata, and Shizune. Spoke the blonde before a small giggle caused her to smile. Oh, and Menma-kun. Finished the woman as the three nodded, Naruto's eyes hardly visible tracing over Tsunade's face, a small smile tracing his lips behind his helm as he saw her. That smile soon shifted, however, as his eyes turned to Hinata as he felt his cheek suddenly heat up at the sight of her. Years ago she had been a quiet but kind girl he had barely known, now he was regretting it as she had blossomed into a beautiful woman that stood before him in a simple cream-colored coat, her long indigo hair framing her soft face that still radiated that soft sense of acceptance he remember. Wait, where did that come from? Wondered Naruto as he looked around to Shizune and then to the others, attempting to keep his mind occupied as he took in the pair of Minato and Kushina, both seeming somehow familiar, though for the life of him he couldn't understand why. Before he could contemplate more he was drawn back to reality as Nunnally spoke again. It is a pleasure to meet you. May I introduce myself, I am Nunnally Vi Britannia, this is my guard Colin, and the Emperor of the United West. Spoke the chair-bound girl, gesturing to the two beside her as the group turned their eyes to Naruto's helmed form, more than one a little shocked to hear who they were standing before. The United West? Asked Tsunade as the three before her nodded, Naruto moving slightly forwards to stand facing the woman he still thought of as family. Hi, it was hard-fought, but our land is once again united. Spoke Naruto as the group from Konoha watched him for a few moments till the little form of Menma let out another giggle, gaining a warm chuckle from Naruto and his companions. It was a pleasure Hokage-sama, but it appears one of your members needs some attention, and we would not detain you. I expect we shall see one another at the festivities. Spoke the blonde as Tsunade nodded, giving a small bow to them before departing, the rest of the group from Konoha following after as the three watched them depart before moving into the office. As the day of the tournament arrived, Colin and Eve found themselves standing on the arena floor among a sea of shinobi and samurai, all watching as the figures of the 5 Cages began their speech on the great victory they had managed to seize years previously. As the speech began, Colin and Eve both found themselves losing interest in the talk, allowing their eyes to move out of the sunken arena, up the surrounding walls and into the stands, moving back and forth until they found the small balcony where Naruto, Wally and Nunnally sat beside a small guard, the younger two waving happily down at the two, drawing a smirk from Colin as beside her the barest trace of a smile touched Eve's lips. As the speeches finally drew to an end, the tournament began as shinobi and samurai clashed to the cheering to the crowd. As another fight began between a shinobi from Suna and a kunoichi Naruto vaguely recognized as Ino, he found his eyes once more shifting over to where he spied Hinata, sitting beside the two Naruto had been introduced to the day before. Below the box, Hinata sat beside Kushina and Minato, little Menma now sitting on her lap waving his little hands out making happy cries as the people cheered. "So Minato-kun, what do you make of those people from the west?" asked Kushina looking around at her husband, who gave a small sigh looking down towards where the waiting pairs stood, focusing for a moment as the white-haired one donned a smooth white helm, emblazoned with twin blue jeweled eyes that seemed to almost glow, while she shifted what looked like a set of larger oddly teardrop-shaped blades on either hips, both housing a hollow center that Minato could only guess at their purpose. "I honestly couldn't say, from what I have seen only the youngest had enough chakra to speak of, but there was something off about their armor. I could have sworn I've seen those symbols somewhere before, but I can't think of where for some reason," replied Minato as Kushina nodded. "What did they look like?" asked Aridid as Minato shrugged. "I'd have to get a second look, but they were covering the joints of the armor on and that one the emperor had them on his helmet," remarked Minato as Hinata looked around, spotting the white-armored woman as she turned back to look up above them. Following her gaze, Hinata saw the booth above, spotting the figures of the emperor looking down at her before he shifted his gaze back to the arena, confusing the girl greatly. However, before she could remark on this, the battle ended with a draw as the next round was called. Below, Eve was signaled forwards, her form-fitting armor shining like a white beacon in the Suna sun as she moved forwards to stand across from a Hivasit shinobi that she remembered, fitting the general description of an Akimichi that Naruto had informed her of. "Superior strength and endurance, suffers from speed and precise as attacks, victory uncertain," muttered Eve as she moved to take her position. As she found her position, a voice reached her ears, causing her to turn her smooth helm up towards the source, seeing Wally waving happily down at her. "Eve," called the happy boy, waving down at the armored figure that felt herself blushing lightly behind her helmet as she weakly raised a hand to wave back, causing the brown-haired boy to smile even wider before she turned back to focus on her opponent. "Re-evaluation, defeat unacceptable, victory commencing," muttered the girl to herself as her hands moved down, gripping the handles of the two flat teardrop cylinders, pulling them free of their holsters so that they lay upon her armored gauntlets, pointing both ahead, the outsides glinting thanks to their sharpened style. Across the arena, Choji felt himself shiver slightly at the blue glint coming from his opponent's helm as he steadied himself for what was coming. Above the arena, within the cage booth, the figures leaned forwards, getting a better look at the armored woman, more than one by now hearing about the supposed revival of the West, more than one wondering just what the ancient enemy of the element nations were going to show them. They didn't have to wait long as the signal went up, prompting Choji to spring forwards, his fist flying forwards and expanding as it rocketed towards Eve. As the massive fist neared her, Eve leapt above the arm, spinning in a graceful arc as her arms shot out the sharpened ends of her. The pair of teardrop cylinders attacked to her arms, swinging down, cutting furrows into Choji's expanded arm, drawing a cry of pain from the man as he stumbled back, his arm shrinking back as Eve landed, turning to face him. "What? But Choji's expansion makes his skin like armor," called Asuma, looking around to the rest of Konoha, who looked just as shocked at the damage the boy had received from Eve's blades. Before they could question more, however, their eyes were drawn back as Choji leapt forwards, jerking himself around as his leg came swelling out, intent to catch Eve in its path of destruction. This time Eve did not move away, instead choosing to slam one bladed arm into the arena floor as she braced for the impact. From the stands, most of the arena looked on in pity at the figure, knowing that such a blow would likely break the woman despite her impressive armor. They were mistaken. As Choji's blow slammed into Eve, there was a sickening crack as the crowd watched the oversized leg bend and finally break around the armored figure that jerked but remained standing despite the devastating impact. As the shinobi's leg reverted back to its usual size, Eve stood, jerking her blade free of the arena floor as she moved over to stand above the crumpled boy, raising one hollow blade, pointing it into the boy's face as a commanding tone issued from her helm. "Yield," called Eve as Choji looked down at himself before nodding, the stadium sitting in silence for a moment till a happy call issued from Wally, once again sparking a few rounds of applause from the civilians and shinobi as Eve moved back to the waiting area, the fellow contestants now giving her a wide berth. That was insane," whispered Kibble, looking around at his sensei, who nodded dumbly at what she had witnessed. "How could she still be standing after that? It doesn't make any sense," asked Sakura, looking around at the others who shook their head, not understanding what they had witnessed either. Above in the western booth Wally was still clapping as beside him, Nunnally smiled down at Eve's performance, casting a slightly worried look to the broken form of Choji before she felt a hand on her shoulder. "He will be alright Nunnally, Tsunade is a first-class medic and he will recover in no time," whispered Naruto as Nunnally nodded. At his words looking back to the matches playing out below. As the day stretched on the gathered patrons watched as Colin and Eve continued to battle their way through the ranks. Some coming out better than others. Colin herself was finally forced to retire after a particularly harsh battle against a rapping oddball from Kumo, though she was at least satisfied that he hadn't walked away victorious from the fight either, having been blasted clear off the arena when she overloaded a storage seal to blast her remaining molten reserves into that odd cloak of chakra he had pulled out. Still after that Kalen's chakra reserves were well spent and rather than showcase her hidden arsenal, Colin chose to bow out leaving the rest to Eve. So as the tournament reached its finale Naruto along with his fellows looked down as Eve moved into the arena. As she did Naruto found himself flashing with barely contained anger as Sasuke stepped up across from her. Him, the one who had chosen to betray Konoha for power, now stood there as people cheered him on. It turned out that after his failure to flee Jiraiya had helped to train the youth alongside Kakashi, making him quite the hero during the war as he slew his brother as well as a few other of the Akatsuki. And now he stood there being cheered on. Fortunately Naruto was able to keep his anger in check as he turned his attention back to Eve, who nodded towards the western booth before focusing back on the Uchiha. "You might as well surrender now, that armor of yours won't save you against me," called Sasuke practically oozing confidence with every word as Eve turned her armored helm to face him. "Just give up and save yourself the embarrassment, run back to the west where you belong," continued the Uchiha smirking at the silence Eve was offering, foolishly believing he was mentally weakening the girl. As he continued Eve simply watched him her arms shifting down to reattach her blades as she prepared for the battle to begin. After a few more shouts the Uchiha seemed to realize his words were not having an effect as his eyes shifted to deep crimson spinning slightly as he glared across at the wide armored figure. "Hey say something. What are you deaf or just stupid like that cheering idiot of yours?" called Sasuke finally getting a reaction as Eve's head snapped up to him the blue eyes flashing as above in the booth even Naruto cringed at the Uchiha's choice of words. "Oh that's going to cost him," muttered the blonde as below the booth the Namikazes and Hinata were looking disgusted with Sasuke's words. "What the heck is wrong with him, this is a tournament, not some private ego trip," muttered Kushina privately disgusted at how far her friend's child had fallen as beside her Minato shook his head. "It's what comes of the village praising him without end, they've given him the idea he can get away with anything what Jiraiya and Kakashi ever saw in him I will never know," spoke Minato privately scowling as the names passed his lips. After their return and Jiraiya's story Minato had cast the man out of his life, telling him simply that until Naruto was found that Jiraiya better never show his face again if he wanted to remain among the living. It had only taken a single trip to the hospital to get the message across. Beside the pair Hinata frowned slightly nodding her head in agreement with the pair's words. "Hi, and he doesn't seem likely to stop anytime soon, he's already believing himself to be some kind of hero," whispered the pale-eyes girl as she looked over to Eve, noticing the obvious protectiveness she seemed to have towards the boy that cheered above them. As Hinata thought of this her own thoughts turned to another protective figure, her mind flashing to Naruto for a second as she looked out upon the arena. "If only you were here Naruto-kun you could show them what a real hero was like. But why am I thinking about you now?" thought the pale-eyed girl as below the observer stepped back preparing to begin the match. Across from Sasuke Eve had gone stiff after his last words, her helm dropping down even as a smirk crossed the Uchiha's face. "Finally found something that gets to you huh? Well don't worry your stupid friend will get to watch me put you in your place," called Sasuke as Eve's blue eyes flashed looking up slowly till they stared directly into the Uchiha's own. Just as the match began Eve spoke a single sentence with such cold authority that it sent shivers down a few observers' spines. "Target confirmed," whispered the wide-armored woman as the call came. Without hesitating Eve swung both her blades forward blue seals suddenly exploding to life along their lengths as the hollow tubs of the blade crackled with sudden power. Sasuke only had a second to dodge as twin blasts of blue light shot forwards cutting past him and crashing into the barrier around the arena with a grinding scream of light as the blasts ate through the first few layers, leaving the remaining seals glowing red with barely contained energy. In the cage booth the Raikage, a hulking muscle beast of a man, sat up staring unbelievingly down at the arena. "Storm release that's impossible," whispered A as most of the other looked on in wonder seeing one of the rarest of bloodlines in play. Only Kushina and Minato recognized the truth below in the stands, both of their mouths dropping open as they suddenly recognized where they had seen those symbols before. "Minato those are," managed Kushina as beside her Minato nodded. "High seals, but there's no way, seals like that have been lost since the time of the first Hokage," whispered the blonde as below Sasuke was rolling to a stop, his face contorted into a snarl as he drew a blade rushing forwards at Eve. Without pausing, Eve turned to him, slamming her feet into the arena, firing off towards him with comparable speed, her blades twisting in a cross-like hole to catch his strike. With a flash of steel, the two blows met, sending sparks up as the two pushed against each other. As the two crossed blades with one another, Eve found herself giving slightly. Realizing this, the woman suddenly stepping back while spinning to send Sasuke past her, an armored leg shooting out to catch him in the back and flinging him forwards, even as she leveled her teardrop cannons, again letting out another lance of destruction smaller than the first, but at a greater speed, causing the Uchiha to dodge wildly to avoid the shimmering death. As he rolled to a landing, the Uchiha snapped out a few kunai, forcing Eve to pull her cannons back to cover her neck and eyes as the kunai glaze off her blade and armor alike. This gave Sasuke just enough time to fly through a set of seals as he spat out a blast of fire that caught the armored girl square in the chest. The smile that had begun to form on the Uchiha's face faltered, however, before it could fully form as he saw his flame glaze off of the armor as another sea of blue seals shone to life along it, causing him to curse at the sight. Without pausing, Sasuke continued to fling fire, water, stone, lighting anything he could across the arena, only to watch as Eve's blades turned them asunder, all being felled by her blades. After a time, one shot finally passed through, slamming a pillar of stone into the armored figure, flinging her back. However, as the crowd watched, even that was not enough, the stone simply crumbling under the glow of more of those blue symbols as the White Maiden swung one blade around, scattering the stone before she rocketed forwards across the arena. "What the hell is this?" called Sasuke as Eve charged him again, swinging her blades forwards, one crashing into Sasuke's blade and sending it flying, even as the second thrust into his Anbu issue chest plate with enough force to lift him from the ground. Looking down, Sasuke saw as the seals started to glow anew, his body now held suspended by the deadly weapon. Eyes went wide around the stadium as the crowd saw the seals beginning to glow and heard the familiar hum of power, but before the blast could come, a voice called out, drawing Eve's head around. "Enough. The match is over. Eve is the winner now, stop," called the judge, rushing forwards as Eve looked from him to Sasuke before allowing her blade to fall, dropping the Uchiha to the arena with an unceremonious crunch before stepping back, nodding to the judge. Most of the arena was completely silent at the sight before them as the crumpled form of Sasuke slowly pushed himself up, glaring as Eve slowly made her way back to the waiting area as above them a few cheers run out. Struggling to stand, Sasuke's mind roared as he heard the cheers at his loss. His cheers, his. Sasuke's mind went red as she saw Eve moving away, his hand suddenly blazing to life with lightning chakra as he glared after Eve. Before anyone could even guess as to Sasuke's intentions, the boy was up rushing towards Eve, his hand outstretched towards her, the crackling causing her to turn, too late to do more than watch as the lightning-inked fist closed on her heart. There was a sudden sound like a cannon blast as the barrier around the arena shattered, sending chakra blasting back across the crowd, causing many to cover their eyes, leaving only a few to witness as the red armored figure crashed through the barrier, smashing into the arena between the charging Uchiha and Eve, his gauntleted hand swinging around to catch the lightning-inked fist. Sasuke's eyes shoot up to see the smooth mask of Naruto's crimson armor, its tail plume waving behind him, even as chakra swirled around him, leaking around the groove in the armor as he held the Uchiha's attack in one gauntleted hand, eyes narrowed in disgust upon the man. "Not this time," growled Naruto, causing a look of confusion upon Sasuke's face a moment before it was replaced with a look of agony as his hand was crushed in Naruto's grasp with a sickening crunch that echoed around the arena. Sasuke let out a howl of pain as Naruto flung him back to roll across the ground to a stop, even as several figures rushed into the arena, many of them from Konoha, to surround Sasuke, a few openly surrounding Naruto and Eve, both of whom looked around seemingly bored at their presence. "Stand down," thundered a voice from above as those below looked up to see Tsunade rushing down, looking around at the Konoha forces, who shifted slightly before obeying, stepping back from the armored pair. "But Hokage-sama, they," started Sakura before Tsunade silenced her with a glare. "Responded to an unprovoked attack by that fool," called Tsunade, glaring down at Sasuke before she turned her eyes around to where Naruto stood beside Eve, both turning to face her. "I am deeply sorry for the boy's actions, he does not represent the stance of our village," started Tsunade as Naruto raised a hand for silence, which just so happening to be the bloody one he had just used to crush the Uchiha's own, before speaking. "Regardless, your shinobi acted to murder one of my people after a fair contest of skill, Hokage-sama. Such an act deserved punishment," called Naruto as over by Sasuke. The pink-haired Sakura growled, glaring over towards the armored pair. "Punishment? You destroyed his hand," yelled the girl as Naruto turned to face her, his tone forcibly calm as he fought to keep his emotions in check at seeing the girl he had once had feelings for defending Sasuke even after his actions here. "The hand he attempted to murder Eve with, I simply removed the weapon," replied Naruto before turning back to Tsunade, pleased to see that she at least seemed to agree with him. "I had hoped to begin negotiations with your daimyo as well, Hokage-sama, however it would seem that if you are incapable of keeping your shinobi in check, I cannot trust my nation's future with you," Should this change I will be willing to hear you, but do not bring this filth with you, or you will find my door closed. Finished Naruto as Tsunade blinked a few times before nodding. I understand, thank you Emperor for your understanding, if possible I would like to speak with you on this matter before you depart. Replied the woman as Naruto turned to Eve before looking back to the booth above where he saw Nunnally and Colin standing with Wally watching him. Remember who you are. CC's words moving across his mind as he steadied himself taking a few calming breaths before nodding to Tsunade. Very well, but it will be upon our ship, you may bring those we encountered earlier, they at least seem to possess manners. Finished Naruto as he turned Eve moving beside him as they marched back to the booth and their companions, leaving the stunned stadium behind to look down at the leftovers of the incident. A few hours after the end of the tournament with the announcement of Eve as the winner, those of Konoha found themselves gathered within the infirmary looking around as Sakura finished patching up the last of Sasuke's wounds, casting worried looks over the teen who only glared ahead gritting his teeth in anger at his loss. Okage-sama, why are you agreeing to meet with them after why they did to Sasuke? Called Kakashi looking over at his student as Tsunade turned to him with a disgusted look. Because Kakashi, unless it escaped you, your student just attempted to murder someone in full view of all of our allies and most of the known world. You're damn lucky I don't kill him myself for being such a fool, called Tsunade as Kakashi looked as though he wanted to speak, only to fall silent at the look the blonde gave him. Be that as it may, Hokage-sama, they are obviously dangerous, those seals around the arena were strong enough to hold a Jinchuriki in place, and that emperor of theirs broke through it without even slowing down. This seems too dangerous. Spoke Asuma taking a puff from a cigarette as beside him Shikamaru nodded. This whole thing is just odd, I mean the United West. They just show up out of nowhere and then practically decimate our best forces. I don't like this. The last time the Land of Sky moved it was to attack our whole nation. Muttered the teen as a few of his fellows nodded even as Tsunade turned to him. Whether you like it or not, this could be our one chance to fix what Sasuke just did. Finished Tsunade turning to leave the room as Shizune moved to follow her. Okage-sama, I'll. Started Kurenai before Tsunade shook her head back at the woman. You will stay here, the only ones invited have already been spoken for, remain here till I return, that goes for all of you. Called the blonde before she marched from the room her assistant in tow to where Minato, Kushina, Hinata and Menma were waiting for her. Meanwhile outside of the village aboard their ship Naruto was seated across from Nunnally and Colin, Eve already resting after having pushed herself to the limit on her last match, and Wally wanting to stay beside her. As Naruto raised his eyes to look across the simply metal table he saw the small frown drawn across Nunnally's lips, drawing a sigh from his own as he leaned back in his chair. I'm sorry Nunnally, but there wasn't a peaceful way around that situation. In fact from what I witnessed it seems Lelich's plan for recognition may have gotten us more than we wished for. Groaned Naruto rubbing at his face as Colin sighed looking up at the cabin roof as she did. Yeah, I mean down in the arena all I got was suspicious looks at best, heck the only one to not outright glare at me was that rapping guy, and I'm pretty sure he was crazy. Weirdest thing too, some kept muttering about a Sky Village. Remarked Colin with a shrug. Sky? You think they mean the first emperor? Asked Naruto as Colin just shrugged. At any rate Nunnally I couldn't let that action stand, I had to act. Continued Naruto turning back to Nunnally who had a troubled look upon her brow. I know Naruto-kun it's just started Nunnally as Naruto nodded. We came here for peace I know. You know I don't want anything else Nunnally, but I can't just let them get away with attacking one of our own either. Still Granny Tsunade's willing to meet with us, so maybe we can make this mess turn out for the best. Breathed the blonde as Colin looked down at him a grin spreading across her face as she looked at him. Oh is that who you want to see, or is it that Hyuga girl you kept sneaking glances at during the match? Asked Colin causing Naruto to falter slightly as both girls leaned forwards, spotting the small blush touching Naruto's cheeks as he tried to look away. I don't know what you're talking about. Spoke the boy as both girls found their grins widening. Really Naruto-kun? Asked Nunnally innocently as Naruto turned back to her his mouth opening as he looked into her innocent face for a few moments before his head dropped in surrender. Okay maybe I was a little. Muttered the blonde as the two girls grinned all the more. Oh I can't wait till CC hears about this. Chuckled Colin as the three moved out to prepare for the coming meeting. Less than an hour later found Naruto, Colin and Nunnally waiting inside the loading bay of their ship watching as a pair of armored guards escorted the group from Konoha into the ship as they looked around curiously at the inside of the machine before their eyes shifted down to focus on the figures before them. Greetings Hokage, if you and your companions will follow me. Spoke Naruto turning to lead them into a large meeting room in the center of the ship, doubling as an observation deck so that the roof was a large glassed-in dome open to the sky above. As the group entered they found themselves at a large central table Naruto along with Colin and Nunnally moving to one end while a few guards took station around the edges of the room watching as the Konoha group settled themselves down. Thank you again for meeting with us Emperor, I apologize again for my shinobi's actions, is your companion alright? asked Tsunade from across the table as Naruto felt a smile touch his lips under his helm. I accept your apology Lady Hokage and thank you for your concern. Yes she is well, only tired from the tournament, if I might ask how is the state of her first opponent I believe his name was Joji. Replied Naruto seeing a small look of surprise on the Konoha shinobi's faces before Tsunade replied. Oh, he will be alright, the bones had to be reset but nothing was too severe. Replied the blonde as beside him Nunnally let a small smile touch her lips. I am glad to hear it, it was not our intention to harm your forces, only to receive the recognition of our empire. I am sure you have heard of our failed attempts to meet with your daimyos by now. Asked Naruto as Tsunade nodded. So that's what this was, they were looking to be taken seriously well they got that in spades now don't they? Thought the cage as she looked around the room they sat in. I must say this ship alone seems capable of that, on top of that your own armaments, I would expect you to have people clamoring to trade with you now. Remarked Tsunade as Naruto let out a sigh. I expect as much as well. However, weapons and our ships are not on the table, such things will remain in the West. Spoke Naruto drawing a confused look from the Konoha forces. But why? I mean your mastery of seals alone would put most villages to shame, why not use that to your advantage? Asked Kushina drawing Naruto's eyes around to her. Because such weapons are only good for war and the West has had enough of that. At the time we are strong enough to protect ourselves, giving weapons to those who could turn them on us is not something we are looking to do. Replied Naruto as the Redeed found it impossible to argue with the man's observations, even as the bundle in her arms let out a small happy giggle, drawing a smile from Nunnally that did not go unnoticed to the mother. You know you can come and say hi. Called Kushina as Nunnally turned her sparkling eyes to Naruto who gave a sigh before nodding as Colin moved to wheel the girl to Kushina where she greeted the little bundle of joy. Well they seem to have the right idea, Hokage-sama, it is obvious that we won't be making agreements today, instead what do you say to simply learning of each other, I offer you to observe our ship in the hopes that we can become allies in the future. Called Naruto rising to his feet as across from him Tsunade did likewise nodding. Thank you Emperor, I believe that is for the best. Replied the blonde woman as she moved over to meet with Nunnally who was now happily holding Menma who grabbed at her long blonde hair. Minato himself soon moved over striking up a conversation with Colin on her storage ceiling, complimenting her use of it in battle as she recounted a few stories for him, creating a nice back and forth between the pair. Outside of this group Hinata turned to see the Emperor moving slowly away, her eyes shifting between the group behind her and back to his departing form before moving after him. What if Konoha begs Naruto to return harem? Thanks for watching my video till the end if you enjoy this content then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.